the Senate of the United States. A resolution to establish a select committee of the Senate to conduct an investigation and study of the extent, if any, to which illegal, improper, or unethical activities were engaged in by any persons acting individually or in combination with others in the presidential election of 1972, or any campaign, canvass, or other activity related to it.
I was approached by Mr. Herbert W. Kalmbach and asked to arrange for a contribution of $100,000 to the committee to re-elect the president. I was told that contributions of this amount would be regarded as in a special class. Since I knew that Mr. Kalmbach was the president's personal counsel as well as counsel to Americans' principal competitor, I decided that some affirmative response was necessary.
NPACT brings you Washington, November 15th. Tonight, unabridged videotape coverage of today's hearings by the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities. Here is NPACT correspondent Jim Lehrer.
Good evening. There were more intriguing tales of laundering corporate money in foreign lands today as the Senate Watergate Committee ended its week of looking at how American corporations illegally met their contributions quotas for the Nixon campaign. But while the details of the transactions involving Braniff Airways, American Airlines, and the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company were again fascinating, the real guts of today's session centered on why these businessmen agreed to violate the law on President Nixon's behalf. Fear, said American Airlines' George Spater, fear that his company would be hurt by the administration if it did not cough up the money. Belief that the re-election of the president was in the best interest of the country, said Goodyear's head man, Russell DeYoung. And speaking of the president, Mr. Nixon is still declining to meet with the Senate Watergate Committee, although he has not yet formally answered the committee's invitation. He has said, however, that he would be willing to meet privately with the committee's leaders, Senators Ervin and Baker. Peter Kay was among those asking Senator Ervin about this as the senator was on his way out of the hearing room this afternoon.
Senator, have you given up on the president? Is that it?
You know, I'm an optimistic person. I always hope that everybody will do what I think common prudence dictates they should do.
Well, is it common prudence for the president to just ignore you?
I don't think so. I think the president should have made these tapes and memoranda available 3 months ago.
Is there anything else you might be able to do to jog him into action?
Well, I'm still hoping that he will meet with the committee and let us ask him some questions.
Despite the fact that the White House just hasn't answered you?
Yes, I'll still live in hopes that people will do the right thing.
Senator, are you ruling out a meeting between the president and just yourself and Senator Baker?
Well, I don't think I'll rule out anything on any invitation or say what I'm going to do about an invitation until I've received the invitation. I got enough things to do without going into business of declining invitations which I have never received and may never receive.
Peter Kay will be back at the close of tonight's broadcast to discuss today's testimony with Bob Jackson, who's an investigative reporter for the Los Angeles Times here in Washington. But now let's go to our menu for the evening. In the first hour, Braniff Airways Regional Vice President in Panama explains how he laundered $40,000 of Braniff funds through a Panama company and then returned it in cash to Braniff officials in Dallas, Texas. A financial official of the company then identifies records of the transaction, including personal checks from corporate executives which were later used to cover the contribution to the Nixon re-election campaign. Also in that hour, George Spater, former chief executive officer of American Airlines, said his company used a Lebanon company Swiss bank account to launder $55,000 that was contributed to the Nixon campaign. Spater said the solicitation was made by Herbert Kalmbach, President Nixon's personal attorney and lawyer for American's principal competitor, United Airlines. In the second hour, Spater expands on a statement that he agreed to make the contribution out of fear that his company would be at a competitive disadvantage if it didn't. He agreed with Senator Ervin that he felt his company might get it in the neck if he didn't come through. Spater was then praised by the senators for being the first corporation executive to voluntarily tell the special prosecutor and the public what his company had done. In the third and final hour, Goodyear board chairman Russell DeYoung says his company channeled $40,000 in cash from a Swiss bank to President Nixon's reelection campaign. DeYoung says he was asked, but not pressured for the donation, by former Commerce Secretary Maurice Stans. And he says the gift was not made with a view to obtaining government favors. Now to Senator Ervin and the call to order.
The committee will come to order. Council will call the first witness.
Camillo Fabrega.
Will you stand up, please, and hold up your right hand? Do you swear that the evidence that you shall give to the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do. Thank you. Be seated. Your counsel will identify himself for the purposes of the record.
I'm Dennis Lyons of Arnold and Porter, Washington, D.C. Senator. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Fabrega is a national and resident of Panama and is appearing voluntarily. I would like, with the permission of the chair, to read first a press release of Braniff Airways Incorporated in order to place Mr. Fabrega's role in the proper perspective. Braniff Airways Incorporated said today, and that is August 23rd, 1973, that it had made a voluntary disclosure to the Office of Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox concerning contributions made in 1972 to the Finance Committee to re-elect the President. Contributions were made on 2 occasions to the committee totaling $50,000. The first contribution, in the amount of $10,000, was contributed out of the personal funds of Harding L. Lawrence, chairman of Braniff, and of another officer of Braniff. The chairman of the committee, who received the first contribution, solicited a substantial further contribution, and in response to this solicitation, monies were made available in the amount of $40,000 out of corporate funds. Certain officers of Braniff and other individuals identified themselves as donors of the $40,000 contribution, and, the spokesman for Braniff stated, these individuals reimbursed Braniff for the total amount of the contribution. The spokesman also stated that no business deduction had been taken for the corporate payment and that the corporate payment had had no effect on Braniff's reported revenues or net income. The spokesman also stated that a disclosure of the transaction had been made to the staff of the Civil Aeronautics Board. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Lawrence will be a witness at a later date, and it is our intention now to question Mr. Fabrega concerning his knowledge of the contribution. Mr. Fabrega, where do you live?
I live in Panama, sir. My position in Panama is a regional vice president for Braniff. As a vice president, I'm responsible for the whole operation in that country.
Is this your only business in Panama?
As Braniff, yes, and then I have a personal business myself too. Personal business. Business.
What is the amount of monthly ticket sales for Braniff in Panama?
Amounts about $500,000 a month.
And am I correct that United States currency is used in Panama?
Yes, I mean, we have a Balboa, but I mean, we don't have any paper money, and we use the dollar.
Do you own a company called CamFab Company, C-A-M-F-A-B?
Yes, sir, I do.
And what is the nature of the business of CamFab Company?
The nature of CamFab is a private enterprise, a family enterprise, family company. We do business on condominiums, buying land, condominiums, apartments.
Does that company have anything to do with Braniff?
Nothing to do, sir.
Did there come a time in March of 1972 when you were contacted by Charles South of Braniff?
Pardon me, sir?
Were you contacted by Mr. South of
Yes, sir.
Braniff? Who is Mr. South?
Mr. South is the Vice President in charge of Latin America Division.
You had a conversation with him at that time?
Yes, sir, I do.
And what was that conversation?
Mr. South called me up requesting if there was any way I can help him to raise some fund.
Did he tell you how much he wanted to raise?
He wants to raise about $40,000.
Did he tell you why he wanted to raise money?
No, sir.
Was anything else of significance said in that conversation?
No, sir. The only thing what I mentioned to him that I have a company which I can help him was CamFab.
And did you have a later conversation with Mr. South?
Yes. After a few days after, he called me back and he told me that he's going to issue a check under the name of CamFab and will send it to me to Panama.
And what happened after that?
After that, I went over to the bank and I cashed the check for $40,000.
You received the check from Mr. South?
Yes, sir.
Do you have the exhibits in front of you that we provided? Could you please turn to Exhibit 2, and I ask you if that is a copy of the check that you received and cashed.
Right, sir.
What did you do with the $40,000 in cash?
Well, after I cashed the check, I took the money to my house, which I put in the safe over there.
And that was the $40,000, is that correct?
Right, sir.
And can you place this in time? When was this check cashed?
Well, I believe I cashed the check as soon as I received the check, I cashed it.
And the check is dated March 29th, is that correct, 1972?
Yes, sir.
Did you take the $40,000 and deliver it to Mr. South, excuse me?
Yes, sir. A few days after, I came over to Dallas for business, and I brought the money over to him.
Did you have a conversation with Mr. South concerning any repayment of this money in any form or raising any cash concerning this $40,000?
Not at that time. I used to deliver the money to him.
When did you have such a conversation?
About a couple of weeks after, he called me up in Panama, and he said that he has to pay this money back to the company. He will send me some ticket stocks.
Ticket stocks?
Right, sir.
These are blank tickets?
That's a regular ticket for Braniff. Blank tickets, of course. Or to be sold in Panama, and from this money to pay him back.
Did you receive these tickets?
I received the ticket stocks.
What did you do with them?
When the ticket arrived in Panama, I give it to one of my supervisors to put it on the counter to be sold.
Did the supervisor sell the tickets?
Yes, sir. She sold the tickets.
What were her instructions?
My instruction was to make a regular report.
Excuse me, I didn't catch that, Mr. Fabrega.
My instruction was for her to sell these tickets and make reports just like other tickets. On these special tickets, this report has to be given to me.
What is the normal procedure with respect to tickets sold by Braniff in Panama?
The normal procedure is that for every ticket that we sold, we make a special form, and this has to be sent over to our accounting people in Panama.
How often is this done?
That's a daily basis.
What happened with respect to the tickets that your supervisor sold on the basis that you just described?
On these tickets, she was giving a report to me, and this report was taken over to my house and put it in the safe.
Did you get cash for these tickets, or did you get cash and checks?
No, I only got cash on this report. Once in a while, we have checks, too.
Did you ask her to try to obtain just cash for these tickets?
I told her this ticket has to be sold only on cash basis.
What happened that made that impossible?
That sometimes people was coming over to the counter to buy some tickets, and the last minute they don't have enough cash, and then they make a check.
What did you do with the cash and checks that you so received?
Well, I took this money over to my house, as I explained before, and then when I have about a few thousands, I was coming over to Dallas for other trips, and I was delivering this money to Mr. South with the report.
How often did you do this?
I don't recall, but I made about maybe 3 or 4 trips, could be.
As of the end of December 1972, how much money had you generated by ticket sales in this fashion?
You mean by December?
Yes, December of 1972. How much money had been obtained?
I believe was about, there was a total amount of $27,000 first, which I delivered.
And you had delivered the entire $27,000 to Mr. South?
Yes, sir.
Did you have a conversation with Mr. South at the end of December?
Yes, he told me that he has some pressure from Brownie that we have to pay the $40,000 to the company, and to please to try to see if I can get the total amount to cover the $40,000. Well, then I told him, Charlie, what I can do is I have to go over to the bank to borrow some money for my own business. If you want to, I can borrow the difference from the $40,000. It was $13,000, which I did, and then I bought a draft, which I sent to him.
And that was a $13,000 draft payable to Braniff, which represented money you had personally borrowed from a bank in Panama. Is
Yes,
that correct?
Sir. Yes.
Mr. Fabrega, I would direct your attention to Exhibit, or Tab 3, and ask you if the documents other than the first 2 pages of that exhibit reflect, among other things, the checks that you delivered to Mr. South, as well, including the $13,000 check that you had borrowed.
Right, sir.
Did you get repaid the $13,000 that you borrowed?
Yes, sir. They pay me back in the same way, selling tickets.
And what did you do with the money then?
Well, that was my money, the $13,000.
And you recovered the entire...
I recovered the entire $13,000.
And approximately when did you receive the final balance on the $13,000?
I don't recall what, but I believe it was about February or March, April, something like that.
It was in early 1973, is that right?
Right, sir.
Did you have any tickets left over?
Yes, all the tickets I got instructions to send back to Dallas.
Did you send them all back?
Yes, sir.
During this entire period, did you know the purpose of the $40,000, what the $40,000 was going to be used for?
Never, sir.
I have no further questions at this time, Mr. Chairman.
In addition to the Camfab Corporation, what other businesses, if any, do you operate in Panama?
You mean besides Brownie?
Right. Besides your work for Braniff, what
yes.
do you do in Panama?
I have other business in Panama, sir.
And what does that business consist of?
I have a hotel business. I have a restaurant business. I have a few franchise, American franchise, diners, Avis rental car.
Now, do I understand your testimony to be that subsequent to your request to raise this money, at no time did you have any idea as to what the money was going to be used for by Mr. South and the people at Braniff?
Never, sir.
Did you sell these tickets in the ordinary course as you would sell any other tickets?
Right, sir.
Did you employ any procedures to make sure that you received only cash and not checks?
Yes, that was my instruction given to the supervisor.
And why was that done?
Why? Because, I don't want to get involved in checks, just in cash.
And my question is, why didn't you want to be paid in checks?
Why I don't want to be paid in check?
Right.
Because for me it was easy to get in cash the money and take it over to the States.
Was that unusual for you? Had you done this in the past for Braniff officials?
Never, sir, in my life.
So I take it that this was something unusual for you to raise this money in cash and bring it to
yes,
Texas?
Sir.
Is
yes,
that
sir.
correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, I take it then you have no knowledge whatsoever as to any conversations that may have occurred between anyone in the committee to re-elect the president and any official in Braniff Airlines?
No, sir, I don't have any.
Did you have to pay interest on this loan that you received, this $13,000?
Yes, sir, they pay me back by the interest, too.
And how did you get repaid that interest by the
In the same
Braniff
way
people?
selling the tickets, sir.
You continued selling the tickets?
Right, sir.
Did you sell them for checks or cash?
Cash.
And how did you ensure that you would always be paid in cash for your tickets? What if a customer wanted to pay for it by check?
I mean, when the customer wants to be paid by check, we get the other stock which I have, and we issue the tickets.
So I take it that you knew this was an irregular batch of tickets that you had. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
I believe you better answer that because I don't believe the reporter can get the nod of your head. I say you nodded your head in answer to that question, but the reporter has to get out in words.
I see, sir.
So you might repeat the question.
Can you repeat the question, sir?
Oh, the reporter will read the question to the witness.
Yes. The last question was, I take it that you knew that there was something irregular about this batch of tickets that you received from Mr. South and then proceeded to sell.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
I don't believe I have any further questions, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Montoya.
I have no questions, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Weichel.
No questions, Mr. Chairman.
And I have no questions. Thank you very much for making a voluntary appearance here. Had it not been for your willingness to do so, we could not have had you here personally as a witness.
Well, I'm glad to go on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Will you please stand and raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear that the evidence that you shall give to the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do, sir.
Could you please give your name for the record?
My name is Neil Robinson. I'm Assistant Treasurer, Braniff Airways in Dallas.
And you're also represented by Mr. Lyons of Arnold and Porter?
I am.
How long have you been Assistant Treasurer of Braniff Airways?
Since March 1973.
Am I correct, Mr. Robinson, that you had no knowledge of any of the events concerning these transactions until late July of this year when you were asked to examine and trace the transaction?
That is correct, sir.
And did you conduct an examination and attempt to trace the various counting entries that went into and comprised this transaction?
I did.
Mr. Robinson, I direct your attention to Exhibit 1 in the, or Tab 1 in the exhibit you have before you.
Yes, sir.
Can you identify that exhibit?
Tab 1 is our file copy, Braniff's file copy of the check made payable to CamFab, along with the remittance advice which remains attached. The immediately following document is a voucher check support, which is used in the ordinary course of business to support a request for the disbursement of funds. In this particular case, it's a charge to an account receivable credit to cash. The third piece of paper is appears to be an inter-office buck slip requesting payment to CamFab in the amount of $40,000.
And what is Exhibit 2, or Tab 2?
Exhibit 2, Tab 2, is a copy of the check, both sides, made payable to CamFab, which indicates that it had been cashed.
So that Tabs 1 and 2 reflect an advance for expenses and service to CamFab company. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Is that an unusual type of transaction, according to your experience?
No. Braniff is a large corporation, and it is ordinary for Braniff on occasion to advance money for services and expenses.
Could you please direct your attention to Tab 3 and tell us what that is? A portion of that, of course, has already been described by Mr. Fabrega.
Tab 3, again, is a cash accounting report, which is used by Braniff to record the receipt of cash. In this particular case, $81,679. The second sheet is a cash receipt item distribution, and it shows the collection of $40,000 crediting an account receivable from CamFab and debiting cash account.
Is that a series of entries of odd amounts?
The debits to the cash account are a series of entries of odd amounts. There is one single credit to the CamFab account receivable.
Do the balance of those documents in tab 3 reflect checks deposited to the account of Braniff?
They reflect deposits of cash and checks, $19,203.38 with various support for checks on back.
Now, is the second document to which you refer the series of entries reflecting the receipt of money by Braniff an unusual document according to your experience?
It would be, yes, sir.
In what way would it be unusual?
Well, it would not be usual to receive from a corporate account to liquidate an account receivable a series of checks in odd amounts made payable to Braniff International by different parties.
I direct your attention to Exhibit 4, and could you summarize what tab 4 is?
Tab 4 are copies of sheets from Braniff's detailed account analysis, which reflects all transactions which are made to accounts in a given period. In this particular case, two documents are present, one showing a debit to account 128013, which is a commercial account receivable, the other showing a credit to account 128013 subsequent to that, both in the amount of $40,000.
Now, under accounting procedures performed by Braniff and other airlines, is income, from an accounting point of view, generated when tickets are sold?
I would prefer to state that from an accounting standpoint, revenues are recognized, realized, when earned, and that occurs when a passenger flies.
And how is it treated when a ticket is purchased?
When a ticket is purchased, either cash or an account receivable is created, a right to receive cash. Becomes a debit to a cash account or a receivable account, and a credit to account known as 2160, which is unearned passenger transportation revenue.
Mr. Robinson, I direct your attention to tab 5 and ask you if you can identify that.
Tab 5 is a cash accounting report which shows the receipt of $40,000 in cash crediting 2160.11, which is unearned passenger transportation revenue.
And what is the source of those funds?
Source of those funds are checks from Braniff officers and others in varying amounts, totaling $40,000.
Am I correct, then, that according to your inquiry, the Braniff was repaid by its executives, the $40,000 expended out of corporate funds?
That is correct, sir.
To your knowledge, was reimbursement sought from the Finance Committee to reelect the President?
To my knowledge, sir, it was not.
Mr. Robinson, if you can do so briefly, could you explain why it is that, according to the press release of Braniff, there were no income tax consequences flowing from the transactions that you've described?
Well, let me state firstly that none of the amounts ever reached the income statement, which would be required for the transactions to have income tax effect. All the entries were balance sheet entries and were balance sheet in effect. Two dates really become significant in terms of the flow of any monies in unearned transportation revenue to the income statement. One is July 31st, the other is December 31st. The unearned passenger transportation revenue account is reconciled 5 months subsequent to a balance sheet date, such that the balance sheet amount as of July 31st would be reconciled at December 31st. And it would show the progression of items through that account. In our particular case, all monies were returned to Braniff prior to July 31st, 1973, such that no adjustment was required in unearned passenger transportation, and no adjustment, therefore, was made to earned revenue.
Mr. Chairman, I ask that tabs 1 through 6 identified by the witnesses be accepted as part of the record of this proceeding.
They will be received in evidence and appropriately numbered as exhibits by the reporter.
I have no further questions.
Mr. Robinson, I take it that while there were no tax consequences, there was an attempt, as feeble as it might have been, to conceal this transaction by means of the false invoice that appears in tab 1. Is that correct?
I really cannot comment with respect to the intent. I have no knowledge of the transaction at the time it was made.
Well, you'll agree, will you not, that tab 1 is an invoice which purports to indicate that $40,000 was paid by Braniff to the CamFab company for expenses and services, and in fact that's not true, is it?
Well, again, I don't believe that I can comment on what the intention might have been at the time that check was drawn, sir. It would appear that it may have been, but I really don't believe that I would be knowledgeable as to the intent.
Well, from your examination of the books, you have found, have you not, that there were no expenses and services for which the CamFab company would have been paid?
There were not.
Pardon?
There were not, sir.
Okay. Now, if this sale of irregular tickets and use of those tickets by the passengers had occurred in May and June rather than December, I take it that there would have been tax consequences pursuant to the July 31 accounting. Is that right?
Had they occurred in significant amounts prior to July 31st, 1972, they may have been recognized in an adjusting entry at December 31st, 1972. As it turns out, the account unearned passenger transportation revenue was in fact overstated at December 31st.
That recognition, as you put it, would have produced tax consequences, isn't that right?
It would have.
No further questions, Mr. Chairman. I don't have any further.
Senator Wycombe. Senator Montalvo.
Just a couple of questions, Mr. Chairman. When is the fiscal year of Braniff, when does it terminate?
The fiscal year as a calendar year terminates December 31st of each year.
What negotiations or conversations did you have in-house when you started account number 216011 with respect to the credit of $40,000? What instructions did you receive? What conversations transpired with respect to this?
Senator, are you speaking of the credit to 216011, which was made 773?
No, I'm speaking of the cash accounting report of dated 7/31/73, in which you assigned account number 216011 and entered a credit of $40,000.
Senator, I received no instructions at that time to debit or credit any specific account. From my examination, I determined that the account which would be deficient should the transaction continue in the way that it had so far would be 216011, and that was the appropriate account to credit for the $40,000.
Was this a running account in the organization?
2160 is a account specified by the Civil Aeronautics Board. It is a running account. The balances are quite heavy through that.
I noticed that you have printed numbers for the other accounts, and this was written in ink.
The document that you're looking at is a cash accounting report, which is used for the receipt of funds from a number of purposes. Those most usually represented on this particular document have pre-printed account numbers and specify the ordinary balance, either debit or credit. In this case, the cash accounting report also provides for the entry of accounts which are not pre-printed, and 2160, as you see, is not listed and therefore had to be listed.
Is this the date on which you received the $40,000? That is July 31st?
Sir, it's my understanding that the checks were received several days in advance of 7/31/73.
How far in advance?
A few days, sir.
All right. That's all, Mr. Chairman.
This, the entry to the effect that this $40,000 had been transferred to a Fab company was a fictitious entry, wasn't it, to conceal what actually happened to it?
Sir, as I stated earlier, I really don't feel that I can comment with respect to whether it was fictitious or not at the time. I have stated, however, that I found no expenses or that may have occurred with respect to CamFab.
Can you tell exactly how this money got from Panama to the United States?
Sir, I have no knowledge of how the money.
Do the papers that you have analyzed as an accountant disclose that?
Excuse me, sir?
Do these papers disclose to you as an accountant as to how this money managed to get from this $40,000 in a corporate contribution managed to get from Panama to the United States?
No, sir, they do not. What they do disclose is that the money was deposited in the operating account, First National in Dallas, and therefore had to be physically carried to Dallas.
Well, I know Braniff is a very large company with many interests. Is it customary for individuals to carry cash payments as much as cash $26,000 rather than carrying a check or some other method?
No, sir, it is not the usual course of business.
Well, the company has issued a press release to the effect that they did make a corporate contribution of $40,000.
Yes, sir.
To the Finance Committee to reelect the president. And this money, this $40,000, was either used by the committee to reelect the president or is still retained by the committee to reelect the president, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
The corporation never got it refunded yet.
Well, sir, the corporation received payments from corporate officers.
But that was done, was it not, after there was some demand by the common cause that that the people who made this contribution be made, their names be disclosed?
Sir, I really do not know what the event was.
When does the record show that the executive officers of Braniff reimbursed Braniff?
In July of 1973, sir.
Well, that was long after the election, which had happened in the previous November.
Yes, sir.
And isn't the only inference to be drawn by you as an accountant from the papers that up to that time that the corporate contribution was in the hands of the committee to reelect the president and still is?
Yes, sir.
Well, in view of the way this was handled, I'll have to say that some men are like the Lord in one respect. They move in mysterious ways. They have wonders to perform. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator.
Oh, wait, one question. You know whether these executive officers who repaid the Braniff for the corporate contribution previously made by Braniff to the committee to reelect the president have ever been reimbursed by any kind of a bonus arrangement on the part of Braniff?
Sir, it is my understanding that they have been not.
Thank you. Counsel, call the next witness.
Mr. Chairman, the next witness is Mr. George A. Spater.
Mr. Spater, will you hold up your right hand? Do you swear that the evidence that you shall give the Senate Select Committee on presidential campaign activities shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Be seated. Will counsel identify himself for the purposes of the record?
My name is Lloyd N. Cutler, with counsel for Mr. Spater.
Counsel may proceed.
I think Mr. Spater has an opening statement he'd like to read.
Until September of this year, I was chairman and chief executive officer of American Airlines. And as the committee also probably knows, in July of this year, American voluntarily disclosed to the special prosecutor and to the public that in the fall of 1971, I was approached by Mr. Herbert W. Kalmbach and asked to arrange for a contribution of $100,000 to the committee to reelect the president. I was told that contributions of this amount would be regarded as in a special class. Since I knew that Mr. Kalmbach was the president's personal counsel as well as counsel to American's principal competitor, I decided that some affirmative response was necessary. I did arrange for contributions aggregating $75,000, of which $55,000 came from American Airlines corporate sources and the balance from personal sources. Full details of how the corporate source contribution was generated and paid had been provided to the staff of the committee as well as to the special prosecutor. But in brief summary, I informed an American financial officer that we might be asked for a substantial contribution, perhaps as much as $100,000. Some months later, he advised me that the money was available. I later learned, and this was a great deal later, in 1973, that it had been generated by an invoice for payment of a commission to a Lebanese firm for the sale of used aircraft. It so happens that the principal in the Lebanese firm has performed real services for American Airlines from time to time, but in this case, this invoice was a false one. By arrangement with him, the funds were returned in cash to American, and $55,000 of this total was used to make contributions to the committee. The $55,000, along with the $20,000 obtained from personal sources, was delivered on Mr. Kalmbach's instructions to the committee's offices in Washington. Payments were made in cash. There were 3 installments of $5,000 each, the first one in December 1971, and a final installment of $60,000 made in March of 1972. Turning to a separate point, I'd like to describe the circumstances which led up to my decision of last July to make a full disclosure of the matter before the pertinent facts had become known to the government from other sources. And I shall also want to offer some suggestions for removing what I see as unfair pressures that are placed on business executives under our present system of campaign financing. In April 1973, after these contributions had been made, representatives of the committee to re-elect the president asked American how the $75,000 of contributions should be recorded on the list the committee anticipated it would have to file in the common cause lawsuit. After an extensive review of the matter with counsel and a review by counsel of the facts, I decided that the illegality of the contribution from corporate sources should not be compounded and that all the facts should be disclosed to the appropriate authorities. As a result of our counsel's discussions with the special prosecutor and his staff, we decided to join with the special prosecutor in making a public disclosure of the facts. Encouragement for such a public disclosure came from Mr. John Gardner of Common Cause. Our counsel had consulted Mr. Gardner because of his earlier public invitation to corporate executives to come forward and to disclose any unreported pre-April contributions in the 1972 presidential campaign. And although I knew then how much personal damage these public disclosures would do, I concluded that they ought to be made, and they were made. Attached to my statement is the American Airlines press release of July 6, 1973, disclosing the corporate contribution. It's true that in making these steps, we sought to mitigate the law violation involved in the corporate contribution by assisting the special prosecutor's enforcement effort. In addition to disclosing our own wrongdoing, we provided details that should help the prosecutor in investing other cases. And moreover, by making the public announcement, we enabled the special prosecutor in his statement of July 6 to urge other companies to follow our example and come forward voluntarily in an effort to put an end to illegal campaign funding practices. And in fact, at least 6 other major national companies did so, and those names of the companies have been announced. The special prosecutor recognized this contribution to law enforcement in his announcement of last October 17th, which we've also attached to the statement. He stated his belief that Americans' decision to come forward voluntarily at a time when no other corporation had evidenced any willingness to do so, quote, had something to do with prompting others to come forward with voluntary disclosures of corporate contributions. And I believe and I hope that Americans' disclosure also helped to stimulate Senate passage of S. 372, which, if finally enacted, would greatly strengthen the present campaign financing laws, and I strongly support the strengthening of these laws. Turning to the area of remedial legislation, I believe that the present system places unfair pressures both on the candidates and on corporate executives. I've said before, I said specifically in my statement of July 6, that most contributions from the business community are not volunteered to seek a competitive advantage, but are made in response to pressure for fear of the competitive disadvantage that might result if they are not made. And the process, in my opinion, clearly degrades both the donor and the donee. The present situation is particularly dangerous when the pressure is implicit in the position occupied by the individual making the solicitation. I suggest, therefore, that congressional consideration be given to the advisability of making certain individuals wholly ineligible to engage in campaign solicitation. In effect, this is really expanding the number of individuals who are ineligible. In particular, I recommend that solicitation by individuals who have just left the cabinet, or who have just left other high positions in the government, or by individuals who are personal representatives of officers currently holding such positions be made unlawful. Now, there's one other aspect, and I'm departing somewhat from my written statement to introduce this. that I think cries for legislative remedy. The usual legislation which forbids act by corporation also includes officers, directors, and principal stockholders. There is no comparable feature of either the existing legislation or anything that I have seen discussed. That is, take the example Corporation A that has stockholders, that has officers who have held very profitable stock options. They can, under existing legislation, make a gift. They can give $50,000, whatever figure they desire. Case B, a corporation that has a very large principal stockholder, perhaps all of his income is derived from the corporation, perhaps all of his assets are derived from the corporation. He is free to make a gift of $50,000. Corporation C, which doesn't have either politically minded directors or rich directors, that either cannot make a gift or must make only an illegal gift. Now, if this looked at purely from the standpoint of the impact on the government, any possible influence that might exist, there's absolutely no distinction that can be made between the case of Corporation A from Corporation B or from Corporation C. It has exactly the same impact. But in one case, Corporation C, which happens to be my situation, I've done something that's wrong, and I realize it's wrong. On the other hand, the same impact can be had by other companies, and is currently the case in other companies that make contributions to their directors or principal stockholders. And I think that's a very unfair thing. There's certainly nothing inherent in our law that says that a corporation that doesn't have rich directors or a big rich stockholder should somehow or other be prejudiced in our process of administration of the government. But whatever the proper legislative remedy may be, I feel strongly that disclosures such as those being made during these hearings compel prompt remedial action. It's time to put a stop to such practices, and I pledge to do all I can to support corrective legislation that Common Cause and others are advocating. Just add in closing that I think that this committee has made one of the great contributions in the history of our republic to good administration of government. I think it can go on and make another enormous contribution by pressing for remedial legislation which will take off the unfair pressures which exist both on candidates and on businessmen under present law. Thank you very much, sir.
Mr. Cutler, will you identify for the record your two associates?
With me are my partner, Mr. Howard Willens, sitting to my immediate left, and to the right, Mr. Herbert J. Miller, both also of counsel to Mr. Spater and American Airlines.
Mr. Spater, were you at one time the general counsel for American Airlines?
I was.
And you are familiar with legal ramifications of all matters affecting American Airlines?
Yes.
When was the first time you met Mr. Herbert Kalmbach?
I can't be exactly sure, but I think I met him at a Republican dinner given in Washington in March 1971. I have a vague recollection. I've tried to search my memory that I met him at that time. I don't recall any particular conversation that I had with him, but I think that I may have met him on that instance.
So you know of no discussion at that particular dinner with Mr. Kalmbach regarding any contribution because you don't even know whether he was there or not?
Yes.
Now, when is the next time you met Mr. Kalmbach?
Next time I met him was in July. I think it was on July 30, 1971, and the circumstance was that I had been asked by Mr. Hofgren. Mr. Hofgren, by the way, had been my host at the March 1971 Republican dinner. Mr. Hofgren asked me would I have lunch with Mr. Kalmbach, and I agreed to do that. I did have lunch with him at that time.
All right. Will you explain to us who is Mr. Hofgren? Tell us something about him.
Mr. Hofgren is a partner or officer of Goldman Sachs, investment banking firm in New York. Prior to that time, he had various positions in the government. The only one I'm familiar with, and maybe this is the only one, is that, as I recall, in 1969, he was working with Mr. Ellsworth, who was part of the administration, later became, I think, assigned to NATO. I don't recall what, some job in Europe. That's where I first met him.
Well, wasn't Mr. Ellsworth in the White House in an area that decided on foreign routes awarded?
Yes, very briefly. I also found out later, I didn't know at the time, Mr. Hofgren was at some point a vice chairman of the committee to reelect the president, the finance committee to reelect the president.
He was your first contact?
Yes.
All right, now you had this luncheon with Mr. Kalmbach. What did you discuss at that luncheon?
Well, the luncheon didn't discuss much about finances. I think Mr. Kalmbach told me that he was engaged, or Mr. Hofgren explained, in raising money from large givers. And other than that, the conversation was a general one about weather, golf, or some other subjects of that type.
All right, now you met Mr. Kalmbach on a third occasion. Where was that?
Mr. Kalmbach called me several months later. My recollection is he called from California, although I cannot be sure of that, and asked me would I have dinner with him, and he named the place at 21 Restaurant in New York. I think it was the call, the date the dinner was held was October 20th. I think he called me sometime in September, although it seems a long time in advance. It was well in advance of the date where the dinner meeting was held.
All right, now at this particular dinner, is this where Mr. Kalmbach mentioned to you the words of art like special class?
Yes, sir.
$100,000 contributors would be in a special class?
Yes, sir.
What was Mr. Kalmbach's method of operating? How did he approach you in soliciting a contribution? Is he soft shell, hard shell, what?
He's very soft shell. He's a very genial gentleman. He said that he first spoke of the special class, and then he said he wanted American Airlines. I'm sorry, I didn't say that. He wanted us, or you, to be in this special class.
Well, what did you think he meant by that?
Well, I guess from my point of view, not ever thinking myself capable of being in that special class because I'm not financially able, I thought that he was referring to American Airlines, but he didn't use the name. And it was a slip of the tongue when I said that he had. He had not. He said, we want you to be a member of this special class.
Although he said you, when you left that meeting, you had an impression in your mind that the you referred to American Airlines as a corporate body.
Well, that may have been because of my own financial inadequacy, but certainly, yes.
All right, now, did you promise Mr. Kalmbach anything?
I said in response that I'd do my best to produce $70,000 or $75,000.
And he's wanting $100,000. Did he voice any displeasure at your offer of $75,000?
Well, I've searched my memory to see if I can recall. My recollection is that he said something bland. If he said something at all, the effect, well, he hoped he'd do better. But in any event, it wasn't a very strong response.
Oh, well, why were you, in a sense, offering $75,000? Were you bargaining with him?
Well, I hoped to reduce the amount as much as I could. Perhaps I should have suggested a lower figure, but I didn't. It was just
you were
impulse.
Trying to save the corporation money.
Yes, I was trying to save money.
A good chief executive officer.
Yes.
Now, afterwards, you went about collecting this money. Whom did you first contact?
I talked to our chief financial officer, and this was somewhat after the July 30 meeting when I'd heard that they were searching for $100,000 givers. I knew pretty much what was going to happen to me next, and so I warned the man that I might be hit for $100,000.
Now, this was prior to the third meeting where Mr.
I think it was prior. Yes, I'm pretty sure it was prior to that meeting, but handwriting was pretty clearly on the wall as a result of the July 30 meeting.
So after the second meeting, you went back to set things in motion because you thought you were going to be, I won't say hit for $100,000, but you thought you would be very strongly urged to give $100,000. Now,
That's correct.
What were the mechanics in raising the $100,000? You first contacted Mr. Lloyd Jones, your next man in charge.
Yes. Let me first add that what I'm going to describe now is something that I learned after April 1973 when we put our counsel to work on dredging up all the facts. I did not know at the time. What I've told you previously, that I asked him to get it, see if he could get it. That's all I knew at the time. What happened thereafter was that through arrangement with a Lebanese agent, we drew a check on the chemical bank for $100,000 cash, and the chemical bank was requested to transmit that amount to a corporation at its Swiss bank account. Amarco, I think is the name, A-M-A-R-C-O company, which apparently was a company controlled by our Lebanese agent. The money was transmitted to Switzerland and transmitted back from Switzerland to the Chase National Bank in New York. The Lebanese agent came to New York. He went to the bank, called one of our subordinate officials to the bank. He received the $100,000 in cash, gave this to our official. Our official took it back to our office and put it in the office safe.
Mr. Chairman, could we identify for the record the voucher for $100,000?
Yes. Did you want me to counsel to offer it in evidence, sir?
Yes.
That is the voucher. Do you want to place it in evidence? Yes.
The document will be received in evidence and appropriately marked as such.
All right, now let's go back and find out who this Lebanese agent is. You contacted Mr. Lloyd Jones, and you said we need to raise $100,000. Now, as far as you were concerned, was that the end of it for you? You didn't care what
I didn't know anything about it until he came back and said we have the money, and I didn't know where it was raised until the investigation which took place in May or June of 1973.
All right, you have subsequently gained many facts to tell you what happened.
Yes, I think I know all the facts now.
Who was the Lebanese agent?
There's a man named Andre Taburian.
Why did you pick him?
I didn't pick him. Taburian. I think it's spelled T-A-B-O-U-R-I-O-U-N. I-A-N.
All right, now he was picked by someone down the line to be the conduit to turn a $100,000 draft into cash. And he brought it back to New York, and then what happened to the cash?
The cash was delivered by him to one of our assistant officers who took it to our office and put it in the office safe.
Now, let's go back and pick up a little piece here that might help explain something later on. On or about October 20, 1971, did you receive 4 checks of $5,000 apiece in the mail from a source?
Subsequent to that, yes.
What did you do with these checks?
I turned those over to one of my subordinates. They were made out.
All right, now, we have the money collected, $100,000 in your safe deposit box in the American Airlines offices.
Yes.
How did this get to the committee to reelect the president? How much? What were the details?
Beginning in December 1971, we made payments. There were 4 in all. There was one payment, $5,000 in cash. I think
Mr. Chairman, could we identify for the record the voucher for $100,000? If you can, yes.
Did you want me to counsel to offer it in evidence, sir?
Yes.
That is the voucher. Do you want to place it in evidence? Yes.
The document will be received in evidence and appropriately marked as such.
All right, now let's go back and find out who this Lebanese agent is. You contacted Mr. Lloyd Jones, and you said we need to raise $100,000. Now, as far as you were concerned, was that the end of it for you? You didn't care what
I didn't know anything about it until he came back and said we have the money, and I didn't know where it was raised until the investigation which took place in May or June of 1973.
All right, you have subsequently gained many facts to tell you what happened.
Yes, I think I know all the facts now.
Who was the Lebanese agent?
There's a man named Andrei Taburian.
Why did you pick him?
I didn't pick him. Taburian. I think it's spelled Tabourion. I-A-N.
All right, now he was picked by someone down the line to be the conduit to turn a $100,000 draft into cash. And he brought it back to New York, and then what happened to the cash?
The cash was delivered by him to one of our assistant officers who took it to our office and put it in the office safe.
Now, let's go back and pick up a little piece here that might help explain something later on. On or about October 20, 1971, did you receive 4 checks of $5,000 apiece in the mail from a source?
Subsequent to that, yes.
What did you do with these checks?
I turned those over to one of my subordinates. They were made out.
All right, now, we have the money collected, $100,000 in your safe deposit box in the American Airlines offices.
Yes,
how did this get to the committee to reelect the president? How much? What were the details?
Beginning in December 1971, we made payments. There were 4 in all. There was one payment, $5,000 in cash, I think all in $100 bills, in an envelope, unmarked envelope, taken to the office of the committee and delivered either to Mr. Sloan or Mr. Nunn, Lee Nunn. I say either. On some occasions they both were there, other occasions one of the other. Again, this is material I discovered later, but anyway, one payment in December, one in January, one in February, that's 3, and then a $5,000 each, and then a final payment of $60,000 in March 1972.
All right, now, was this all in cash?
Yes, sir.
Were they pleased with that arrangement at the committee to reelect?
Well, I recall the man who made the delivery said to me one time they seemed to be pleased to receive cash.
Was it in $100 bills?
Yes, sir.
Do you know if that was a request made by the committee to reelect that it be in $100 bills?
No, sir. There was no request as to how it should be made either by Mr. Combach or, as far as I know, by the committee. That was the way our people chose to deliver it. I think that's the way it was received from Mr. Taburian, too.
So what was the total amount that was delivered to the committee to reelect?
$75,000, of which $55,000 came from the corporate sources.
All right. Now, that leaves $45,000 somewhere that you had collected through the exercise in the Lebanese agent. What happened to that $45,000?
Well, all the money in the safe at the time of the investigation was turned back to the company into the regular channels of the company.
So far as you know right now, that $45,000 is back into operating capital.
Yes.
All right. Now, at any time during this episode, I will call it, did you have contact with Mr. Maurice Stans regarding the contribution?
No.
Did you have contact with him otherwise regarding any business dealing with American Airlines?
Yes.
Would you explain it?
This was, of course, after the contributions were made. We had pending at the time merger with Western Air And the merger agreement expired, as I recall it, in February and had to be extended, and it was extended about 3 or 4 times. During this time, rumors began to fly around Washington that the White House was opposed to the merger. You realize that in a merger of this type, under Section 801 of our Act, the President makes the ultimate decision. Civil Aeronautics Board merely advisory. Final decisions made in the White House, and it's not reviewable by the courts. I made an effort to find out whether these allegations were true, because when I came to the Western people and wanted them to renew the agreement, they were very skeptical about the desirability of doing it. Under the agreement, that they were restricted from making dividend payments, making changes in their corporate structure. And the agreement had already been held up over a year at this time. We still didn't have an answer from anybody as to whether we could or could not merge. So I went to Mr. Stans, I'd known him in other connections, and asked him whether he could find out whether it was true that the White House did oppose, and to let me know if that was the case.
Did he let you know?
He never, no.
Well, first of all, why'd you choose Mr. Stans? There are people at the White House who could have given you the direct answer.
Well, I didn't know anybody in the political arena at the White House. I knew Mr. Flanagan, but I checked with him, and he didn't seem to think there was anything to it, except the rumors kept going around, and there were for example, even articles published in our aviation news, one by Mr. Robert Six, who said the White House was opposed to it. I couldn't find out any opposition, but here was one of our rivals in the case who was announcing publicly that the White House was opposed to it, and I was having great difficulty getting the agreement extended with Western Airlines.
Now, Mr. Spater, did you receive a call from Mr. Kalmbach around about April the 26th, 1973, regarding the contribution that you had set into motion?
I did.
What was that call about?
I was in San Francisco on my way to the Far East, and he called me. I called my office in Washington, left word to my secretary who was anxious to reach me, and he left his home number and his office number, and my secretary inquired what he was calling about, and he wouldn't tell her, so I thought perhaps it was important to call him. I did call him, and I reached him immediately, and he said that Mr. Stans had called him and told him, Mr. Kalmbach, that it might be necessary, he thought it would be necessary, to release information as to contributions in the Common Cause lawsuit. And if this was done, it would show that American Airlines had given $75,000.
All right, what did he want you to do, give him some names?
He didn't say anything more at the time. There were subsequent calls that involved the question you asked me.
Right, well, explain those subsequent calls. And who
they did not come to me, but our office in Washington did receive calls from Mr. Kalmbach's office, not him personally, but I believe his secretary, first in which we were asked to state the names in which the $75,000 contribution should be reported.
And what did you respond?
Well, this is the time we made no response. We've been talking with counsel, and we agreed, as I pointed out in my statement, we couldn't compound the situation. We had to tell the truth. The truth was the money had come from American Airlines. Therefore, as a consequence of this, after deliberating with counsel, we decided we must make a disclosure.
All right, now, did your counsel make contact with American Airlines about this time and ask that the money be returned, the corporate gift?
With the committee, you said that counsel made contact with American Airlines?
With the committee to reelect the president.
Reelect the president.
Yes.
I believe that is tab number 3 here, Mr. Chairman, a letter from Mr. Herbert J. Miller.
That will be received in evidence and appropriately numbered by the reporter as an exhibit.
Thank you, sir.
Now, was that request honored by the committee to reelect the president?
It was, and they returned the money.
How much?
It's $55,000.
What happened to the other $20,000?
Still remains in the coffers of the committee or it's been expended. I don't know what's happened to that. We made no request for its return.
Was that listed as a contribution by you?
Yes, it was listed as a contribution by me.
Now, when the people from the Committee to Re-elect called you and asking for names to attribute to the contribution, did you have a feeling that they wanted you to come up with some kind of a name?
I had no feeling except that they wanted us to tell who were the real contributors. And I think that subsequent examination of some of these lists indicate that the names employees of American Airlines were stated, that is in the Rosemary Woods list. I think an examination of that showed that it said in that list, which predated these calls, excuse me, that
we haven't seen the Rosemary Woods list, but the list that the committee finally filed.
Oh, I'm sorry, excuse me. The list that the committee finally filed in the Common Cause says employees of American Airlines.
Now, Mr. Spater, aside from the contribution we've just been talking about, were there any other instances of services rendered to presidential campaigns of 1972 for which there was no consideration received by American Airlines?
Yes, there was one instance.
Oh, where was that, and what was it?
One of our employees in Texas worked for the Democrats for Nixon, and he went off the payroll. Unbeknownst to me, I knew he went off the payroll, unbeknownst to me, out of people's humanitarian belief that he needed the help, he was assisted, and he was paid an amount equivalent to his compensation. When it was revealed to him that this came from corporate sources, he reimbursed the company.
Now, his name was Mr. Woodward.
That's right.
And he received an equivalent of his salary for 2 months. How much was that?
$10,000.
So that means he was making about $60,000 a year.
Yes, I think that probably would include all of his compensation plus benefits.
Now, was that reported to the special prosecutor?
Yes, sir.
Was any action taken on it, adverse to you or the company?
No, it was treated as part of the whole picture that you're familiar with.
Now, do you know of any other instances?
No, sir.
Mr. Spater, at any time, your knowledge, was there any quid pro quo involved in this transaction, the main transaction of the $100,000?
No, absolutely not.
Now, you did have a number of things pending before various federal agencies at that time, like all other airlines.
Yes, and as we always have had for the last 35 years, and presumably always will have.
I think Mr. Cutler has supplied, Mr. Chairman, a listing for the committee of all matters affecting American Airlines.
That's a list furnished in response to a request from committee counsel of all matters currently pending before the CAB in which American Airlines has an interest.
This is accurate.
This is a current.
Yes, sir.
Yes. Let the record show it's admitted in evidence and will be appropriately numbered by the report as an exhibit.
Mr. Chairman, I have no questions at the moment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Spater, I'd like to ask you a few questions concerning that dinner meeting that you had with Mr. Kalmbach, at which this contribution was discussed. During that meeting, did Mr. Kalmbach make any promises, either express or implied, that he would be able to help you in some way if you contributed to the committee to re-elect the president?
No.
Was there any discussion at that meeting with Mr. Kalmbach that your contribution should be made in cash?
Not that I recall.
Well, you would recall it if there were, would you not?
So much has happened since then. I don't think there was, but I simply, we're talking about a conversation that took place quite a long time ago, and I don't recall it.
You have no recollection that there was, is that correct?
No, I have absolutely no recollection.
Now, during that conversation, and subsequent thereto, when did you decide that you would make a contribution to the committee to re-elect the president? And when did you decide in what amount that contribution would be?
Well, I more or less decided it at that dinner meeting. I said that we would make a contribution or 70 or 75. We tried to. And then when I got back to the office, I decided, well, I said 70 or 75. I'll make it 75. It wasn't a very scientifically arrived at decision, but that's what took place.
Now, as I understood your testimony, did you indicate that you had a vague recollection that there was some statement that you could do better than the 70, 75?
I'm sorry. You have to. I didn't hear. The last part was drowned out.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Was it your testimony that it was your recollection vaguely that there was some statement that you could do better than 70 to 75,000?
I think what I said, or at least what I meant to say, was that there was no strong response. If there was any response at all, it was a mild response, such as perhaps, I hope you can do better. But there wasn't any vigorous response that it's got to be $100,000, that type. So later on, and maybe these two things are confusing, but later on, when money was actually being delivered at the committee headquarters, either Mr. Nunn or Mr. Sloan said, we thought it was going to be $100,000. And Mr. Collins, who delivered the money, said, well, he didn't understand that from me, and he came back and asked me. And I said, no, 75,000. So that was the end of that. But those are the only two incidents you might have in mind.
My question was directed to Mr. Kalmbach, and I understand your testimony. You're not sure whether he said anything at all.
No, he may not have said anything. I just recall it may have been some mild remonstrance, but it wasn't violent.
Now, was it your decision that the contribution should be made in cash?
No.
Whose decision was it?
Well, it's probably made by default in respect as we had cash, and so that's the way it was delivered. I don't think that there was any great cogitation over it. The money that we received from Mr. Kalmbach, from Mr. Taborian, came in cash, and so it was probably just used without any great discussion.
Well, was it requested to come in cash?
No, sir.
Now, you didn't have cash lying around in that amount. You had to generate a false invoice to raise that money, did you not?
That's true.
Did you instruct Mr. Jones or any other employee that it be raised in cash and transmitted in cash?
No.
When you told Mr. Jones that you thought that you were going to be asked for $100,000, did he ask you any questions about how's he going to raise that much money? Or
no.
No questions whatsoever?
No.
I take it that he knew how to operate this false invoice and how to carry it out without being instructed?
Well, that's a hard question to answer. I don't think he actually handled the transaction himself. He asked somebody else to do it. But the company that handles a large amount of money probably does know how to handle transactions.
Well, what I'm getting at is whose idea was it to create this false invoice and raise the money that way?
Oh, that was somebody lower down in the organization. It was not Mr. Lloyd Jones.
Someone who was employed by American Airlines, I take it?
Yes. I think it was a man who was formerly employed by us who no longer is.
Now, when you were
No, I'm
not in relation to this incident.
It had nothing to do, his departure from the company had nothing to do with this case.
Now, when you were asked for this contribution in the $100,000 range, and when you instructed Mr. Jones to raise that money, I take it that you knew that it was going to be raised from corporate sources. Is that correct?
I wasn't sure. I guess I could have concluded it would be, but it wasn't clear. I didn't tell him to take it from corporate sources. If he could have derived some other money from other sources, I would have been very pleased.
Well, you indicated in response to an earlier question that you yourself, as chief executive of American Airlines, couldn't have raised that much money. How would you think that a subordinate of yours would have been able to raise that much money?
From other sources than myself.
Pardon?
From sources other than myself. Other people.
Other people in American Airlines?
Other people in American Airlines or people we've done business with, done favors to.
Now, it's true, is it not, that many corporations have what is known as good government or political action funds by which employees contribute their own?
Well, I don't. That's a hard question to answer. I don't think he actually handled the transaction himself. He asked somebody else to do it. But the company that handles a large amount of money probably does know how to handle transactions.
Well, what I'm getting at is whose idea was it to create this false invoice and raise the money that way?
Oh, that was somebody lower down in the organization. It was not Mr. Lloyd Jones.
Someone who was employed by American Airlines, I take it.
Yes, I think it was a man who was formerly employed by us who no longer is.
Now, when you were
No, I'm
not in relation to this incident.
It had nothing to do. His departure from the company had nothing to do with this case.
Now, when you were asked for this contribution in the $100,000 range, and when you instructed Mr. Jones to raise that money, I take it that you knew that it was going to be raised from corporate sources. Is that correct?
I wasn't sure. I guess I could have concluded it would be, but it wasn't clear. I didn't tell him to take it from corporate sources. If he could have derived some other money from other sources, I would have been very pleased.
Well, you indicated in response to an earlier question that you yourself, as chief executive of American Airlines, couldn't have raised that much money. How would you think that a subordinate of yours would have been able to raise that much money?
From other sources than myself.
Pardon?
From sources other than myself. Other people.
Other people in American Airlines?
Other people in American Airlines, or people we've done business with, done favors to.
Now, it's true, is it not, that many corporations have what is known as good government or political action funds by which employees contribute their own money to this fund and it's used for a lawful contribution. Is that right?
Yes, and we've since created such a fund.
Well, I guess you've answered my question. You didn't have such a fund at the time.
No, sir.
Why didn't you create it then and raise the money that way rather than making a corporate contribution?
Well, you couldn't do it in time.
Pardon?
You couldn't do it in time. We've had this in effect for several months, and I put a percentage of my compensation into the fund, but if you add up all the amounts, it takes a long time to accumulate $55,000.
So I take it that you had no knowledge as to whether Mr. Kalmbach knew or did not know whether you had such a system or whether you might raise the money that way.
No, sir, I didn't know.
Now, inviting your attention to what's been admitted into evidence before the committee and is found at tab number 3 in the letter which was sent by American Airlines to request the refund of that contribution. American Airlines stated that they had no evidence that the committee to re-elect the president had any knowledge that the funds received were corporate funds. Is that a correct statement?
Well, it's a statement by our counsel, Mr. Miller, that he had no such evidence, I believe.
Based on our investigation, Mr. Madigan, that's a correct statement.
Now, turning, if I might, for a minute to the litigation that was pending before regulatory agencies.
Yes, sir.
Could you tell us first how long you were the chief executive at American Airlines prior to this meeting in July and October of '71?
Let's see. I became chief executive in February 1968.
And were you a working chief executive, working on company matters all the time?
I certainly was.
Did you spend any of your time on the proposed merger between American and Western Airlines?
Yes, I did.
And were you working on that matter at the time that you had the 2 meetings with Mr. Kalmbach?
Yes.
During those meetings, was this merger discussed at all?
No. Mr. Kalmbach was attorney for a principal rival in that case, principal opposition or opponent in the case.
Now, did the fact that this merger was pending play any role in your decision to contribute this money to the committee to re-elect the president?
I think I was motivated by a host of fears, and as I explained, and it's impossible for me to add up, tabulate all of the items that went into it.
And I would have to go over to the Senate.
I see.
Stand in recess to census get back.
There is a vote on the Senate floor and a break in our replay of the hearings. Public television coverage of the Senate Watergate hearings will continue after this pause for station identification.
Unabridged coverage of the hearings is being broadcast as a public service by your local public television station. This is PBS, the Public Broadcasting Service. From the nation's capital, NPAC presents Washington Week in Review, an analysis each week of the major news stories from the White House, the Congress, the Pentagon, and elsewhere. With Peter Lesagor, Washington Bureau Chief for the Chicago Daily News. Neil McNeil, Chief Congressional Correspondent for Time Magazine. Charles Cordray, Military Affairs Writer for the Baltimore Sun. Plus a guest Washington correspondent, covering such fields as foreign policy, the economy, politics, space. It's a freewheeling 30... From Washington, NPAC continues its coverage of hearings by the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities. Here again, NPAC correspondent Jim Lehrer.
As we go back to the hearings, there are more questions for George Spater.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We were discussing the merger the merger agreement between American and Western with respect to your participation as the chief executive of American Airlines in that merger negotiations. Now, I understood from your testimony, Mr. Spater, that you contacted Mr. Stans with regard to the White House's position or opposition or rumored opposition to that merger. Is that correct?
Yes, I asked him whether he could find out whether it was true that the White House was opposing the merger.
And when did you contact Mr. Stans?
I believe it was in June 19... late May or June 1972.
So this would have been after the contribution was made, is that correct?
Yes.
Now, there is in the White House, according to statute, a branch which is designated by statute to approve or be involved in the approving process of the CAB decision with respect to that merger. Why didn't you contact that branch of the White House rather than Mr. Stans?
I don't know what branch that is. I'm familiar with Mr. Flanagan's function, but I had heard this as a political branch of the White House had taken this action. I didn't know anybody in the political branch of the White House.
Mr. Flanagan, the statute vests the power to approve or disapprove mergers involving international air routes. in the President, not in any branch of the White House.
It vests that power in the President, and there is a group in the White House, a branch, a section, whatever you'd like to call it, that's headed by Mr. Flanagan that deals with these matters on a day-to-day basis. Isn't that correct?
I know about Mr. Flanagan's function, and I explained that I did make an effort through his office to find out whether it's true, and his office reported they knew nothing of it, but the rumors continued. And they did not emanate from his function. They emanated from what I would call the political end of the White House.
Now, did you ask Mr. Stantz to take any action with respect to this pending merger agreement?
No, I asked him to find out whether it was true that the White House was opposed to it.
So there was no point to extending.
Now,
you see, the reason for it, of course, there's no good purpose served in extending the agreement. If the White House is going to turn it down, there's no court review, I just take my marbles and go home. And that's what Western wanted to do. They wanted to call it off. I wanted to find out whether we should be called off.
Well, you had an interest in seeing that the merger was approved, did you not?
Wasn't that yes, I was interested in having it approved, but if it was not going to be approved, then I wanted to call it quits and go a different direction. We've been held up for a year at this stage.
Now, in response to an earlier question, you indicated that there was no quid pro quo expected, and in fact, that decision was decided adversely to American Airlines and that the merger was disapproved. Is that correct?
True.
And when did that occur?
Let me just refresh my recollection. Actually, I knew about it at the end of July. The decision by the Civil Aeronautics Board, I believe, was made in June. Such decisions in international cases are not publicly announced. They are transmitted, they're recommended decisions, they're transmitted to the White House, then circulated by the White House, by budget, I believe, to the other departments. And then after the final action is taken by the President, in this case, he approved the turn down of the merger, then they're publicly announced. So it was announced at the end of July. I think the action by the CAB, their recommendation that it be turned down, was made sometime in June.
In your testimony, Mr. Spater, you directed your remarks at some point to the possibility of, or the advisability of, creating restrictions upon persons who were high government officials or former high government officials from soliciting contributions. Would you feel that similar restrictions should be promulgated with respect to a prohibition, say, of a person who either personally or through his business is engaged in major litigation with a regulatory agency to prohibit him or his company from contributing to presidential campaigns?
Well, I haven't thought anything about it. I don't.
When I say prohibit him from contributing to presidential campaigns, I mean during the pendency of that litigation, as long as the litigation is pending.
Well, it would be, personally, as far as I'm concerned, that would be fine, but I'm not sure about, I think I'd like to analyze if we're going to give a broad-gauged judgment on something like that as to how it would impact the whole economy. I don't visualize it. It would not affect me adversely. I'd be for it.
Now, with respect to the mechanism used for raising this $100,000, how did you decide, once you knew that you had $100,000, to contribute only $55,000 to the committee to re-elect the president?
I think I explained that earlier. I had made the decision, really on the night in which I saw Mr. Kalmbach, to give $70,000 or $75,000. I decided the following day to make it 75 of the two figures I mentioned. Then things fell in line. I had $20,000 to give from personal sources. That was given. That left $55,000 to be given from corporate sources. That was given.
And what was done with the remaining $45,000? Was it kept outside the normal course of bookkeeping with respect to American Airlines books?
Well, until the investigation by counsel, and then any money in that safe was returned to the corporate coffers.
During the time that it was kept in the safe, was that $45,000 used to pay the $10,000 salary of that employee that worked for Democrats for Nixon?
I believe it was. I'm not certain, but I think it possibly was. But however, that money was paid back by him, so that would have been replaced.
Did you arrange for a false invoice of any kind or false voucher to cover the $10,000 that was paid to that employee?
I never arranged for any false vouchers any time, but there was no false voucher in the $10,000 case arranged by anybody.
Well, I take it that the books must have showed that he was on leave when, in fact, he was being paid $10,000.
That's right. And there was no necessity to create more cash because the cash had already been created. The reason for the voucher, as I explained, was to provide the cash. The cash was there, and presumably it was taken from that cash, used for that purpose, and replenished when the individual repaid the amount. He discovered that it came from corporate funds, and he repaid it.
In deciding upon a $75,000 contribution, why was not the contribution made entirely from corporate funds? Why did you use the $20,000 from personal funds that you received?
Well, it was available for that use, and I used it. I didn't really focus on it.
No particular reason?
No. I would have preferred making the whole contribution in a way that would be unobjectionable, but I wasn't able to do it.
Is the reason that you made the contribution from the $20,000, which were not corporate funds, because you felt that the reelection of the president would be in the best interest of the country? Is that the reason, or was there some other reason for the contribution?
I made the contribution for reasons I explained, that I was fearful that if I didn't do it, that our company would be placed at a competitive disadvantage.
By the administration?
Yes.
Well, go back to my earlier question. If that was the reason that you gave it, why didn't you use the corporate funds? Why did you use this $20,000 of non-corporate funds?
It made no difference to the recipient as to where the money came from. I had money from personal sources, so I used it. I really wasn't focused on it at all. I had a pot of money, and so I used it as I explained. But there was no decision other than the fact that I've indicated I would have preferred to make it all from personal sources. If I could have raised it that way, I couldn't.
Did you make any attempt to raise it through various executives or what have you in the American corporation?
I didn't. It may have been done by Mr. Lloyd Jones. Other people reported to him. I've just told you actually what took place, and there's nothing else that I know of other than what I've told you.
Well,
made no other efforts.
You say it may have been done. You know from the investigation that it was not done, do you not?
I'm sorry.
I say you indicated that it may have been an attempt to raise it from personal sources. Well, you know from your investigation into the facts that it was not attempted.
Yes. Well, I don't know that it was not attempted. I know none was raised. All the money raised is as I've explained them to you. And there was no other money raised.
Was there any restrictions on this $20,000 that it should be contributed to the reelection of the president as opposed to
Absolutely
another?
Not. I had a free hand. Whatever way I wanted to use it, I made the decision, personally.
Now, the law has been settled for some time, since
I'm going to have to recess. There's another vote.
Another quick Senate vote. When the senators returned, Assistant Minority Counsel Michael Madigan continued his questioning.
Mr. Spater, I began to ask you that it's been in the law since 1910 or so that corporations were prohibited from contributing to political campaigns. I note your suggestions with respect to the solicitation activities of government officials in your statement before the committee. Do you have any suggested remedy to put a stop to the procedures that testimony before this committee has indicated is going on with the use of false invoices, etc., to generate funds, corporate funds, which are used for contributions?
Well, I think it's necessitated by the pressures that have been brought, and if the pressures were relieved, the invoices wouldn't have developed. Another element, of course, is for the first time since 1910, the law is being enforced. The law has been in effect for, 60 years and never been enforced until a special prosecutor was appointed.
I take it that you think then that the present laws we have are sufficient if they're enforced vigorously. Is that correct?
No, I don't think that they are. I think it's very unfair that the present laws are applied as they are and as limited as they are. I think that laws on the books should be enforced.
I don't believe I have any further questions, Mr. Chairman.
Isn't it fair to say that if there's any industry in the United States which is peculiarly susceptible to express or implied pressures from people exercising governmental power, it's the airlines?
Yes, sir. Absolutely right.
Is it an exaggeration to say that the federal government, through the various agencies, including the White House, has virtually the power, by their decisions, one way or another, to determine the economic life or economic death of an airline?
Absolutely right, sir.
In a supplement to a memorandum which was supplied by Mr. Cutler at the request of the committee, this statement is paired. It is generally recognized that American Airlines is a member of an industry subject to comprehensive federal regulation. At any particular time, officials of American Airlines estimate that the company may be directly interested in approximately 20 or so important matters pending before the Civil Aeronautics Board or other federal agencies. To give the committee some idea of the number and range of the regulatory matters before the CAB, attached is a recent listing of matters at the CAB in which American Airlines is participating. The most important matters before the CAB during the period from 1969 to 1972 included the following: implementation of the award to American of a route to Australia. Second, the proposed American Airlines Western Airlines merger. Third, the general investigation of passenger fares. Fourth, the mutual aid agreements among the airlines. Fifth, the capacity limitations agreements among the carriers. And sixth, investigations and proposed regulations relative to commission and other payment to ticket agents and tour packages. In addition, the company had several applications pending during this period to serve destinations in the Orient and Europe and to provide service to important markets in the United States such as Miami and Des Moines and Omaha. Is that a correct statement?
That is a correct statement.
This statement, I've already put in the record the Economic Regulation Department exhibit, and I'll put this statement in the record and have it marked as exhibit. Now, the American was very much interested in a continuation of a merger agreement it had with Western Airlines at the time of this contribution, wasn't it?
That's sir. That's right.
And that was a matter that was subject to the unreviewable decision of the President himself.
Yes, sir.
And Mr. Herbert Kalmbach, whom you knew to be the personal counsel of the President, and a man very close to the President, contacted you at the number you've described, and he stated that he would like to have a contribution of $100,000 for the committee to reelect the President. Now, did you draw the inference from what he said that he was trying to get $100,000 from you personally?
Well, it never entered my mind that he was, because I simply don't have the capacity to do it, but that's a subjective evaluation.
Well, as a matter of fact, facing the realities, with the tremendous, almost confiscatory nature of federal income taxes at this date, it is not reasonable that there can be very many $100,000 contributions obtained without resorting to corporate funds. Isn't that true?
That's right, except possibly from major stockholders.
Yes.
I don't happen to be one of those.
And there are not very many people that with the income tax rates on a joint return going from 55% up on as much as $64,000 with all the other living expenses and obligations they have that can give such things as $100,000. They're about as to use a North Carolina expression, about as scarce as hen's teeth, aren't they?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
My friend.
Now, here under these circumstances, Mr. Kalmbach came in and said he wanted a contribution of $100,000 and that he was hopes that it would be received and that all those who made a contribution as much as $100,000 would be put in some kind of a select class.
Yes, sir.
Well, didn't you interpret that as a sort of implied promise as far as Mr. Kalmbach could make one, that people who had made contributions of $100,000 would have superior consideration to people who were not able to make contributions that much?
Well, there was the other possibility, and that was a negative one, which is one very much in my mind, and it's, I think, as a result of the hearings before this committee, it probably might be something, and that is that you would be regarded as persona non grata if you didn't. I mean,
yes.
There are two aspects. Would you get something if you gave it, or would you be prevented from getting something if you didn't give it?
In other words, to use a vernacular expression, it instills a request of this kind has a tendency to instill a fear that if you don't comply, that you might get, to use a vernacular expression, get it in the neck from some government agency.
That's right, yeah. And Mr. Kalmbach, of course, was lawyer for our principal competitor who was opposing us in this merger case, so I didn't believe that giving him the money would help us in that case.
But you did believe, you did feel that if you didn't give the money, there might be some adverse consequences.
Yes, sir. I was worried.
Well, with all due, departing from the normal use of language, wouldn't it be fair to say that requests from people in high authority who control great governmental power, or who have direct access to those who control great governmental power, when they ask for contributions, there is a sort of unspoken coercion in the request, isn't it?
An unspoken spot, sir?
Doesn't a request for campaign contributions of persons who, from industries or the officers of industries that a particular subject to government regulation, have the effect, although there's no coercion spoken, but they have the effect of some kind of an implied coercion, don't they?
Yes, sir. I explained it when I was talking to council staff. It's something like the old medieval maps that show a flat world and then what they call terra incognita, fierce animals lying around the fringes of this map. And you just don't know what's going to happen to you if you get off in there. I think that sometimes the fear of the unknown may be more terrifying than the fear of the known. And I think this is a very large element in the picture.
Well, I think that's a very apt illustration of the point that you make. Now, most of all these regulatory agencies, which have to do with the regulation of airlines, are headed by men who are presidential appointees, aren't they?
Yes, sir.
I thought you made some very helpful suggestions as to possible legislation, and I'd like to ask you another one that's not covered in your statement.
Yes, sir.
Don't you believe that Congress should adopt a law similar to that which it did in the Cannon Bill, which is passed by the Senate, which puts a severe limitation upon the amounts of contributions that could be made for political purposes in cash?
Absolutely.
And as a corollary to that answer, I'll take it that you agree that there should be some positive requirement that campaign contributions be made, if they're any substantial nature, in the form of checks rather than cash.
Yes, sir.
And furthermore, in this day of shredding of documents that are not have potentially dangerous consequences or embarrassing consequences, don't you think that some positive requirement should be made by law upon persons making campaign contributions of a substantial nature and upon persons receiving campaign contributions of substantial nature, that they preserve all documentary records relating to those contributions for a substantial period of time after the election?
I think that'd be a very valuable provision.
I want to commend some of your statements on page 4. You state, I believe that the present system places unfair pressures both on candidates and on corporate executives. As I said in my statement of July the 7th, most contributions from the business community are not volunteered to seek a competitive advantage, but are made in response to pressure for fear of the competitive disadvantage that might result if they are not made. The process degrades both the donor and the donee. I don't believe that a more accurate statement could have been made than that statement made by you.
Thank you, sir.
And you followed it. It is particularly dangerous when the pressure is implicit in the position of the individual making the solicitation. I suggest, therefore, that congressional consideration be given to the advisability of making certain individuals wholly ineligible to engage in campaign solicitation. In particular, I recommend that solicitations by individuals who have just left the cabinet and other high positions in the government, or by individuals who are personal representatives of officers holding such positions, be made unlawful. Now, if Congress, prior to the campaigns which preceded the election of 1972, had passed a law prohibiting the solicitation of campaign contributions from the executives of business organizations by people occupying positions those you suggested, there would have been a lot of this, the contribution which American Airlines made and would never have been made, would it?
No, sir, they would not have been made.
And don't you think it's reasonable to assume that that is true in respect to other contributions which came from corporate funds rather than individual funds?
I believe so. Reading the accounts in the newspapers, I think the same thing would have been true, and that's why I feel strongly about this provision as being a very basic one.
And do you not agree with me that we must have some strong legislation in this field if the confidence of the American people in those who hold high political office and in their government is going to be restored?
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
Senator White? First, I want to commend you on recognizing the truism that an honest confession is good for the soul, and I think you've done a fine thing in going to the special prosecutor and the American Airlines and you. I think you all were the first ones to go to the special prosecutor and make a complete revelation. And you've done a fine thing, I think, in the presentation you made before this committee.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to follow up on that point, because if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Spater, weren't you the first person to step forward and in this area of corporate contributions during the campaign of '73 and make a voluntary statement of what had occurred to the Spater?
Yes, sir, it was.
I think that, and up to that point, if I'm not mistaken, I don't think anybody had, even though nobody in industry had opened up at all.
No, sir.
And I suppose the thing that concerns me and throughout here is I think we have every right to expect leadership, certainly, from industry, and yet almost from the outset, at least in the public comments that have been made, there's sort of been a minimizing of the entire area known as Watergate, and there have been very few people like yourself to stand up. What motivated, did you figure that the time had come to draw the line here? I noticed that your career with American Airlines has spanned a period of time. Had you run into this type of situation, I'm not saying the giving of corporate funds, I'm not saying doing of anything illegal, but the putting the arm on industry, or more particularly on your company, by other administrations. Had this gone on before?
Well, I think there'd never been an example like this in two respects. One, the individual who made the solicitation or the solicitations, and two, the amounts. You know, if you're talking about high jumping, you know, if you ask somebody to jump 2 feet, he can do it. You ask him to jump 8 feet, he can't do it. And I think one of the results is that the amounts were so enormous, it just drove people to do things that they didn't want to do. Certainly I didn't find any relish in doing this. I knew it was wrong, hated it, and it's been very much on my conscience. So obviously I was delighted to be able to rid my conscience of it.
So actually, this was unique in the way of the size of the amount requested and from insofar as where the request came from.
Yes, sir.
In your experience.
Yes.
You did make reference in your testimony to the fact that this is the first time that the law has been enforced. Laws that have been on the books since the early 1900s. What is the image? This is the thing that bothers me sometimes. What is the image of the business community and of the leadership of the business community as far as politics is concerned? Are we all looked upon as you know, having our hands in the till, or the fact that entrance into our offices or to the seats of power can only be gained by money? I sort of have the impression that there's an image held by business leadership, of political leadership, that almost has us all for sale.
No, sir, I don't agree with that. I've had many experiences in Washington since 1933, and I've found many occasions it was possible to go into offices and make a presentation purely on the basis of merit. There's no interest on the part of the member of Congress to receive the information other than to arrive at a just result, and I've been very fairly treated. I would say that my own experience has been good, and I think that most men feel that way. I think sometimes people like to write a rousing speech and they want to find fault with somebody, but I think the general attitude of businessmen toward Congress, members of Congress, is just like toward other businessmen. They're humans, and some of them are better than others. So, but I don't think there's any feeling such as you would express that the Congress is not doing a good job and the members of Congress are not devoted to their work. I've been around enough to know that I put in a lot of long hours myself, averaging 60 or 70 hours a week, and I find the same thing down here. All evening sessions, weekend work, and so I have a high respect for the Congress.
The work of this committee, and I'm not trying to ask your evaluation of individual guilt or innocence, because that's not the job of this committee, but the work product of this committee and what it's bringing forth. Do you consider what's coming out here to be a good thing for the political system in the United States, or do you think it's tearing down the country?
No, I think it's one of the greatest contributions made by any committee since the Republic is founded. I really think it's one of the outstanding performances, and I think this is the general attitude of the people of our country. People feel secure that the committee, or divergent views, is ultimately desirous of getting at the truth. I made some comment like that in my opening statement. I wanted to add to it, and I did add to it at the time. I think the great job that remains to be done is the effort by this committee to ensure that the necessary legislative changes are made so that what you've done is not done in vain. I think it's very important that that be carried forward.
Thank you, Mr. Spater. And I thank you, as I said. Obviously, it was a difficult decision for you. I don't know if ever, quite frankly, the facts would have ever come forward. Possibly they wouldn't have if it hadn't been for your voluntarily stepping forward and indicating a matter that obviously was of concern to your conscience. And as I said, I think so many times the business community is maligned, just as my profession is. And it's good to know there's still men with some guts to go ahead and stand up and draw the line and face up to the facts. So I thank you for doing what you did, and we'll try to go ahead and do what we have to do.
Thank you very much, sir.
Senator Montoya.
Mr. Spater, I want to associate myself with the commendatory remarks which have been expressed here by Senator Ervin and Senator Weicker.
Thank you, sir.
Now, one of the things that disturbs me here is why you succumbed to the competitor's lawyer's solicitation at the time.
I think if the man who had made the solicitation had only been lawyer for our competitor, there wouldn't have been any problem. The problem rose from the fact the man who solicited was personal counsel to the president. He was the trustee of the president's personal estate. And there is implicit in such a position pressures that may be even more frightening than the explicit pressures.
Didn't you consider the solicitation very audacious at the time in view of the fact that the solicitor was the lawyer for one of your competitors?
Well, I certainly was very surprised by it. I didn't know, as I explained earlier, I didn't know what it meant. It meant to me something akin to the medieval concept of the world you don't know about. It's got a lot of beasts in it. You don't know what the beasts are. And actually what has been revealed in the hearings before this committee indicate that if I'd known that, I might have been more afraid than I was at the time.
Now, you didn't, during your three conversations with Mr. Kalmbach, give any slight thought to the possibility that he was trying to obtain from you a voluntary contribution for $100,000, did you? Emphasis on the voluntary.
No, I don't. I don't think he would have introduced the idea with this idea of a special class if he'd, or nor would he have approached me from that point of view.
I noticed that, and I think we ought to put this in proper perspective, that you had settled with him for $75,000.
Well, I hadn't actually. I think what I'd said to him was I'd try to get up $70,000 or $75,000, and there was no kind of a bargain or anything like that. It was a comment in reply to him.
And honorable. during your 3 conversations with Mr. Kalmbach, give any slight thought to the possibility that he was trying to obtain from you a voluntary contribution for $100,000, did you? Emphasis on the voluntary.
No, I don't. I don't think he would have introduced the idea with this idea of a special class if he'd, or nor would he have approached me from that point of view.
I noticed that, and I think we ought to put this in proper perspective, that you had settled with him for $75,000.
Well, I hadn't actually. I think what I'd said to him was I'd try to get up $70,000 or $75,000, and there was no kind of a bargain or anything like that. It was a comment in reply to him.
And on or about October the 4th, you already had 4 checks for $5,000 each.
No, sir, those came later.
Those came later?
Yes, sir.
So actually, you assembled $120,000 altogether.
Yes.
And then contributed $75,000 to the committee to re-elect the president.
That's correct.
Now, how were these funds delivered?
The funds
Notice
were all...
that you stated, you mentioned how $5,000 was initially delivered and other sums, but give me the chronology and the detail of how every bit of these funds were delivered.
The first $5,000 was delivered to the committee to re-elect the president in December 1971. A second $5,000 was delivered in January, a third $5,000 in February, and the remaining $60,000 in March 1972.
Well, then, let me interrupt you there. Now, where did you get the $20,000 that you delivered prior to the cashing of the $100,000
That was
check?
from personal sources.
From those checks?
Yes, sir.
That's the point. That's the question I asked you. Had you these checks in your possession prior to the cashing of the $100,000?
Yes, sir. I'm sorry. Yes, we did.
All right. Proceed.
Oh, in each case, the money was delivered in cash in an envelope which was unmarked, and I think in each case in $100 bills.
And who were the individuals who contributed $5,000 each?
It came from a friend of mine.
Well, you mentioned 4 individuals.
Total amount came from one source, from a friend of mine.
Well, were there 4 checks from the same source?
Yes, sir.
I see. All right. That's all, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Spater, I have only one question. Senator Irvin quoted your statement a moment ago. The process degrades both the donor and the donee. Well, in fact, when you're put in a situation like that, it degrades and belittles the stockholder, doesn't it? That stockholder has a right to know where his money is going.
Yes, sir.
And I think that we've forgotten that many times. Your stockholders had no voice in that whatsoever.
No, sir.
Nor in any of the others. So it's not only the donor and the donee, it's the stockholder.
Yes, sir. We were glad, therefore, to get the money back, so the stockholders not out anything in our case. Money was all the corporate money was replaced, but what you say is certainly true.
Thank you.
Just a few questions, Mr. Spater. With respect to your testimony concerning the state of mind of Mr. Kalmbach or what he might have thought, could you explain a little bit about this good government fund that American Airlines is beginning to institute or has instituted since these matters have arisen?
Yes, I can explain it very briefly. I think it was set up in October 1972, and of course it's completely voluntary. Any officer or employee may contribute whatever amount he designates. I think we've indicated in some cases that 1% is okay. Nobody has been forced. I don't know who the other contributors are. I know I have myself, but I don't know a single other one. That there probably are some, but I simply don't know the names. The money is handled by a bank as trustee, and the individual who's put the money up designates the candidate to which the fund should go. And that's.
I think I should point out that the legality of such voluntary funds and corporate activity in organizing such funds was made clearly legal for the first time in the Campaign Financing Act of 1971, which took effect early in 72.
Well, I believe it's true that certain corporations did use either political action funds or such good government funds prior to the time that act went into effect.
But the legality of those funds was in considerable doubt up to that time.
Well, the point I'm making, Mr. Spater, is that we really don't know what went through Mr. Kalmbach's mind, and my question to you is, do you know whether he thought maybe you had one of those funds or you might have raised the money some other way?
I don't know.
Now, was there any reason that these contributions were made by 4 separate trips of $5,000, $5,000, $5,000, and $60,000, as opposed to a lump sum contribution?
No, I think that at the time the first contribution was made, that was all that we had. We had one check for $5,000, but I don't think there was any great deliberation over that. Certainly I didn't participate in it.
And was there any particular reason?
If I can help on that, our investigation showed that the money was delivered as each of these 4 checks was received and could be cashed, and then after the large amount came in through the source Mr. Spater described. And that was the reason why the money was delivered in the 4 installments. As the money was received, it was paid over to the committee.
And was there any reason why you just didn't transmit the checks rather than cashing them and transmitting cash to the committee?
Not that I can think of.
No other questions, Mr. Chairman.
This so-called good government fund is entirely a voluntary fund.
Completely voluntary.
And each donor has a right to designate the candidate that he wants to receive his contribution.
Correct. Yes, and no one in the company knows who he designates.
Yes. So. Now, the thing that concerns me, I don't know how you avoid a lot of regulation in the airline industry or in radio and TV, but I've been concerned for years about the steady accretion of power in the federal government, and I have resisted it. To the best of my advantage, I've been in a minority and resisted it. But what it concerns me, I think it calls into play Lord Acton's aphorism that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I think one of the greatest tragedies of this country when they ever put the decision of any man, an unreviewable decision. Well, thank you very much for your very fine contribution to the work of the committee.
Thank you very much.
We'll stand in recess till 2:30.
Lunchtime for the committee and break time for us. Public television coverage of the Senate Watergate hearings will continue after this pause for station identification.
Unabridged coverage of the hearings is being broadcast as a public service by your local public television station. This is PBS, the Public Broadcasting Service. From Washington, NPACT continues its coverage of hearings by the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities. Here again, NPACT correspondent Jim Lehrer.
After lunch, the senators heard from the next witness, Russell DeYoung of the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company.
The committee will come to order, and counsel will call the first witness, or the next witness.
Mr. Russell DeYoung, please.
Will you hold up your right hand? You swear that the evidence that you shall give to the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Be seated. And counsel, please identify himself for the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Daniel Gribben. I appear as counsel for Mr. DeYoung. Seated behind Mr. DeYoung is Mr. Lane, Vice President of Goodyear, and seated behind me is Mr. Myers, Vice President and General Counsel of Goodyear.
Thank you.
Mr. DeYoung, I understand that you have a prepared statement, and if you'd like to read it, could you please do so now?
I would like to read it. My name is Russell DeYoung. I am Chairman of the Board of Directors and Chief Executive Officer of the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company of Akron, Ohio. I began to work for Goodyear in 1928 and have spent my entire working life with the company in various capacities. I became Chief Executive Officer in 1964. I am appearing here under subpoena to state the circumstances under which Goodyear made a political contribution in the 1972 presidential election. The contribution originated in a conversation I had with Mr. Maurice Stans, whose acquaintance I had made largely as a result of our association on Business Advisory Council and other groups involving meetings between businessmen and government officials. At a meeting of such a group in Washington on or about February the 16th or 17th of 1972, that I believe was concerned with environmental problems, Mr. Stans told me that he would be contacting me about a contribution to the Committee for the Reelection of the President. The discussion occurred in a brief, informal conversation between business sessions. I told Mr. Stans that it would be unnecessary for him to come to Akron because I would send someone to see him. I recall no discussion at that brief meeting of amount, by whom the contribution should be made, or the method by which it might be made. There was some mention of making a contribution prior to April 7th in order that it would not have to be publicly reported. When I returned to Akron, I discussed the matter with Mr. Arden Firestone, Vice President of Goodyear. As a result of that discussion, Mr. Firestone, on March the 9th, delivered $20,000 in cash to Mr. Stans in Washington, D.C. I did not attend that meeting, but was later informed that Mr. Stans did not ask and was not told the source of funds. Mr. Stans said he had hoped for a contribution in the range of $50,000, but he did not state or imply that any pressure would be brought if a larger contribution were not forthcoming. It was decided that, in light of Mr. Stans' reaction, an additional contribution would be made. An additional $20,000 in cash was turned over to Mr. Stans by Mr. Firestone at his second meeting in Washington on March 14th. On this occasion, 2 personal checks, one from my wife in the amount of $2,000 and the other from me in the amount of $3,000, were also delivered to Mr. Stantz. I did not attend that meeting either, but understand that, as on March 9th occasion, there was no discussion with Mr. Stantz as to the source of the contribution. The cash used in making the contribution came from volume discounts from suppliers of Goodyear's foreign subsidiaries. Such amounts were transferred to the United States through normal banking channels from an account maintained in Switzerland. I was never personally involved in the handling of these discounts. I am advised, however, that for a period of time prior to 1967, certain of our European suppliers were directed to deposit volume discounts in an account in a Zurich bank designated GOYEDA, standing for the Goodyear Deposit Account. From time to time, amounts were withdrawn from this account and kept under the control and custody of an officer of the company in Akron. No discounts were channeled into this account after 1967, when a new financial officer, B.M. Robertson, took over. The account itself was finally terminated in 1970. There is no longer any cash from this source in the custody of any company official. The amount used in making the contribution was never entered on the company's books as income, and it was never taken on its tax return as a deductible expense. The $40,000 contribution that I have described was the only contribution made by Goodyear in connection with the 1972 presidential election. It was made solely because we thought the reelection of the president was in the best interest of the country. It was not made with a view to obtaining government favors, nor was I pressured in any way into making it. Goodyear's total business with the federal government, most of which is obtained at competitive bidding, constitutes less than 3% of its sales. At the time the contribution was made, the company was not engaged in any significant litigation with the government and was not aware of any material problems it faced with any branch of the federal government. No Goodyear employee in charge of government business was aware of the contribution, and there is no indication that any government official was made aware of the contribution. In July of this year, company officers voluntarily disclosed to the special Watergate prosecution staff the full details of Goodyear's 1972 contribution to the Finance Committee for the reelection of the President. At that time, the company's board of directors was informed of the contribution for the first time. Following such disclosure, the company, on August 9th, 1973, requested the Finance Committee to re-elect the President to return the $40,000 contribution. The company has received a check from the Treasurer of the Finance Committee, which will be reflected in the company's income for 1973.
Mr. DeYoung, could you please give the committee some idea of the nature of the business of Goodyear and the size of Goodyear?
Goodyear is a company that basically manufactures rubber and rubber-related products, such as wheels and brakes, both airplane and truck passengers. We manufacture chemicals, the polyesters, the synthetic rubbers, and other petrochemicals of that type. We're very largely involved all over the world in manufacturing operations. And our sales for the year of 1972 was $4,076 million.
Mr. DeYoung, I gather from your opening statement that Mr. Stans did not suggest any particular amount for you or your company to give. Is that correct?
That is correct.
How was the figure, the initial figure of $20,000 arrived at?
Well, we kicked that around, but we finally decided that was the least we could do.
What do you mean by that?
Well, anything below that figure didn't look like much.
What did you base that on?
Well, there wasn't really any basis for it.
Had you heard what other companies...
Not at that time.
Later on you became aware?
Later on we did.
To your knowledge, did Mr. Stans ever request that cash be supplied?
No, he did not.
Why was the contribution made in cash?
Because we had the cash available.
And the cash that was available had come earlier from the source you described?
Which I have described.
So that the nature of the funds would be a little clearer, could you give us a possible example or even a hypothetical one how the cash might have been generated?
Well, in Europe, a lot of your suppliers give you what you call a volume discount if you purchase so much of your materials. And usually, for example, let's say you purchase $1 million worth of materials for the year, which you may or may not purchase. You may not need that volume, but on assumption that you do, then you may get roughly, say, a 0.5% additional discount. And that would not be coming in until you completely purchase that amount.
What would happen to that discount?
Well, from certain companies, it was directed to send their discount to this bank account, which I have described.
And the money was kept on deposit in that account, is that correct?
Yes.
So that, in effect, the documents supplied to the foreign subsidiaries by the suppliers would fail to reflect a quantity discount that was being granted to the subsidiary of Goodyear. Is that correct?
Wait a minute, I don't quite understand that question now.
Well, in the documents that would reflect the purchase by the Goodyear subsidiary, there would be no mention, I gather, of the quantity discount.
There'll be no mention until you happen to reach that quantity of purchase. So there's no mention at all until, in other words, you had purchases. In the hypothetical example I use, if you only had purchased, say, $950,000 at the end of the year, there'd be no discount. So there's no reason to be any papers to that effect until that's earned.
And then the final document would indicate the quantity discount, or would that be handled separately?
That's generally handled separately.
So that the quantity discounts would not be reflected in the ordinary documents exchanged between Goodyear's foreign subsidiaries and the foreign suppliers. Is that correct?
No, because not necessarily, because there may be several subsidiaries in different countries purchasing the same materials, and they wouldn't know what their quantities were that.
But the companies that made the contributions to the Swiss bank account would not indicate on the invoices or other documents the fact that they were paying this
Well, once again, technically, I didn't know. I wasn't involved in this, so I can't really describe to you the technical problems that were involved.
What was your understanding as to the source of the funds, Mr. DeYoung?
Just so I described, volume discounts.
No, at the time the contribution was made to the 1972 presidential campaign. What was the extent of your knowledge at that time?
The source of the funds?
Yes. Did you know they were quantity discounts at that time?
I believe so.
And you also, of course, knew then they were corporate funds?
Oh, yes.
Now, after the initial delivery of $20,000 to Mr. Stans, I gather Mr. Firestone came back to you and expressed what Mr. Stans had told him. Is that correct?
Right.
And it took you and Mr. Firestone 5 days before an additional $20,000 was forthcoming.
That is correct.
And along with the $20,000 in cash on the second occasion was $5,000 that you and your wife contributed, is that correct?
That's correct.
And these represented your personal funds and in no way...
personal funds.
Was there any reason why, in the light of Mr. Stans' request for $50,000, that $45,000 rather than $50,000 or less was granted?
You never give anybody as much as they ask for.
Did there come a time when you or your associates were contacted with respect to the possible disclosure of the contribution?
Did there come a time?
Yes.
Yes.
When was that, and how did that occur?
That was occurred in April 1973.
What happened then?
Mr. Firestone had all the contacts with Mr. Stans on this matter. Mr. Firestone consulted with me throughout, and I understand the basic facts to be as follows. In April of 1973, Mr. Stans asked for the names of the individuals who had made the $40,000 contribution in March of 1972. He stated that it was highly probable that the Finance Committee would eventually have to make public a list of the individual contributors. He said that the committee records merely showed that the contribution came from Goodyear employees. We first tried to get the money back, but Mr. Stans said that was not possible. After further discussion within the company, we decided to give Mr. Stans the name of 8 Goodyear executives, including my own, and divide the $40,000 among the 8. This was done with the approval of the executives, but with a clear understanding that they would not at any time become involved in any perjury. We gave the names because we thought the company might be harmed by the publicity. It became known that Goodyear as a company had made a sizable contribution to either political party.
Did you personally ask the company executives if their names could be used in response to the request by Mr. Stans?
I did.
And did each of the employees agree to have his name utilized in this connection?
They did, on the basis that they would not become involved.
Thereafter, did you or Mr. Firestone receive a letter from Mr. Parkinson asking confirmation of the contributions by the individuals?
We did.
Is that tab 1 in the exhibit in front of you?
That's right.
What was the response of the company?
We replied that we could not confirm these names.
Is that the document, tab 2?
Yeah, July 11th.
What occurred after that in your communications with the Finance Committee?
Well, thereafter, in early July 1973, we discussed with the council, and then we decided to bring all the facts to the attention of the Watergate staff, as I have indicated in my statement.
Did you ask that the contribution be returned?
We did.
And was it returned?
It was.
In connection with that request, was that the first time that you notified the Finance Committee to re-elect the President that the funds were corporate funds?
I think it was a day or two prior to it. I'll have to check it. Sir?
One more floor vote, and now back to Russell DeYoung.
The committee went to vote. We were discussing the communications you had with or your company had with the Finance Committee to re-elect the President, and I asked you if tabs 3, 4, and 5 represent communications between your company, your attorneys, and the Finance Committee to re-elect the President.
That's correct.
Mr. Chairman, I ask that tabs 1 through 5 be accepted as part of the record in this proceeding.
That record shows they are received as evidence and will be appropriately marked as exhibits by the reporter.
Mr. DeYoung, with respect to the other officials of Goodyear Am I correct that at no time were they ever asked to make any false statement to anybody in connection with their role in the campaign?
That is correct.
One other matter to clarify something. Mr. DeYoung, you testified during your opening statement that the Swiss account was closed in 1970. At that time, was a sum of money brought to the United States or transferred to the United States?
It was.
Where was that sum of money kept?
In a safe, company premises.
In the company offices. Mr. Chairman, I have no further questions at this time.
You have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. DeYoung, was the only contact that you had with Mr. Stans your initial meeting with him in February of 1972 with respect to your contributing to the committee to re-elect the president?
That's correct.
And have you spoken to Mr. Firestone, I believe it is, who talked to Mr. Stans at the two meetings in March of 72?
Did I speak to Mr. Firestone? I don't understand your question.
Right. Did you speak to him concerning what took place at those meetings?
Yes.
And at any time did Mr. Stans imply or exert any pressure on your company or on Mr. Firestone to contribute to the committee to re-elect the president?
No pressure, except they felt that our amount first time was low.
Now, could you tell the committee what was the reason that you decided to give this $40,000 to the committee to re-elect the president?
Well, on that basis, we felt we were low then.
Pardon?
We felt that what we learned from Mr. Stans, we were low.
I mean, why did you decide to give any contribution to the committee to re-elect the president rather than to anybody else?
What do you mean, anybody else?
Any of the opposing presidential candidates. Why did you decide to give a contribution to the committee to re-elect the president?
As I said in my statement, it was solely because we thought the re-election of the president was in the best interest of the country.
And that was the sole reason?
That's correct.
Now, do you know of any reason that Mr. Stans should have had to think that you could not have raised the $40,000 through some source other than corporate sources?
I don't know what his thoughts were.
Does your company have any sort of good government fund by which individuals contribute to presidential campaigns?
We do not.
Would it be possible to raise that money through contributions from various executives of the corporation?
Well, I assume if I wanted to put enough pressure on, I could, but I'm not about to do that.
Now, if I might ask you a few questions about the Swiss account. Do I understand your testimony to be that, to use an example, if you had a purchase for $100,000 and got a 10% discount, that the $10,000 would be funneled off into this special Swiss account, and that is the money that you use for this corporate contribution? And that system stopped in 1967, is that correct?
That's correct.
And in 1970, the account was completely closed?
That is correct.
The money, the $40,000 that was contributed, was that money in that account in 1970?
Yes.
And since that time, has the company engaged in any system to generate cash, such as the discount system?
We have not.
I believe that's all the questions that I have, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. DeYoung, how did this money get from the discount account over in Switzerland to the United States?
By normal business channels, banking channels.
But what were they?
Well, we're constantly transferring money back and forth between banks because we're doing business all over, and it's just the normal channels. It's a debit on one and a credit on the other.
Well, it wasn't carried by hand from Switzerland to the United States.
No, not at all.
Now, I'll have to be frank and say I don't find your statement that the reason the company has sent this money in two payments of cash, very convincing. I spent a large part of my life as a lawyer, and I did much work for corporations. And I've searched my memory in vain since hearing your testimony, and I don't recall a single time that a corporation ever paid me a single penny of compensation for legal services except by check. So was there some reason different for the fact that they had cash, that they paid in cash?
Well, cash has a tendency to get lost. It's obscure.
It has particularly a tendency to get lost from view, doesn't it?
That's correct. Yeah, that's right.
So I would find it more convincing if you had stated that Goodyear sent this $40,000 of corporate funds down here by cash in order to conceal the fact that it was making a corporate donation. Now, isn't that a fact?
That's right.
Yeah. Fine. And they could have transmitted it down here. If it had been a legitimate transaction, they would have transmitted it down here in all probability by either sending a letter down here with a check in it on 8-cent cash instead of paying the transportation cost of the vice president to and fro 4 times between Washington and Akron, wouldn't it? Wouldn't that have been the normal thing to do, either that or let the bank in Akron or whatever other bank you had your money in call up to the bank down here in Washington, let them issue a check for it?
That's normal business practice, yes.
Yeah. Now, after the election, and when Common Cause got to be active in this, Mr. Stans had a conversation with you, didn't he?
Not with me.
With Mr. Firestone then?
That's correct.
And he told Mr. Firestone that he needed some names of some individuals. He might have to divulge this instead of the name of the Goodyear company, didn't he?
That's correct.
And so he was kindly supplied with the names of 8 men, corporate executives, who are allegedly what opposed as the donors of this money when they hadn't given a single penny of it. Isn't that so?
That's correct.
So was that intended to, who was that intended to deceive? Somebody.
Well, really it was a delay in action.
A delay in action?
So we get done.
That was given to Mr. Stans so he could tell the court in the Common Cause suit that...
Now, when we were asked to confirm it, we denied that.
What? I know. As I get you, you say these men wouldn't have gone and committed perjury. If they'd been summoned and given required to tell an oath, take an oath to tell the truth, they wouldn't have committed perjury, but they were willing to have a false representation made that was not made on oath. Isn't that so?
That's correct.
Well, thank you. Senator Montoya.
I don't appear to ask any questions, Mr. Chairman.
Senator White.
I notice on page 3 of your statement, you indicate it was solely because we thought the reelection of the president was in the best interest of the country. It was not made with a view to obtaining government favors, nor was I pressured in any way into making one. Now, who is we thought?
Mr. Firestone, myself.
Mr. Firestone, yourself?
Yes.
Did you step forward and volunteer your information to the prosecutor after American Airlines did it? What motivated you to step forward at all?
Because the publicity was getting, and we found out then it was very, very serious what we'd done.
Well, I mean, the degree of seriousness didn't change. It was serious when you did it. So it was a matter of being discovered, of the publicity that was of concern to you?
That's correct.
Now, has any judgment been passed on Goodyear?
There has been.
Pardon?
There has.
And what did that consist of?
On October 17, 1973, the Special Watergate prosecutor staff filed in the United States District Court for the Northern District of Ohio an information which charged both the company and me with having committed misdemeanors in violation of Section 610 of Title 18 United States Code by making and consenting to the $40,000 contribution in connection with the presidential election of 1972. The company and I pleaded guilty to the charges. Maximum fines were assessed by the court, have been paid both by the corporation and myself.
Well, what fines were assessed?
$5,000. The maximum fine was $5,000 to the company and $1,000 to me personally.
And the shareholders all will be sharing in the paying of the $5,000 fine? Is that right?
What do you mean?
Well, the $5,000 fine paid by the corporation.
That's right.
So, in effect, all the shareholders are involved in paying the fine, right?
That's correct.
Even though shareholders weren't consulted as to whether or not they thought the reelection of the president was in the best interest of the country, nevertheless they're going to pay for the actions of you and Mr. Firestone. Is that right?
Well, they pay for all actions of the corporate decisions that are made, good or bad.
Well, it's a pretty sorry day for Goodyear, wouldn't you?
Not necessarily.
In other words, again, it's only a matter of publicity, not of principle, that had you step forward and has you before this committee. Is that correct?
That's probably correct.
It's a pretty sorry day. That's all I've got, Mr. Chairman.
I have no further questions.
Do you have any? No further questions. Well, thank you, Mr. DeYoung. That's you excused. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Weichel.
Mr. Chairman, I'd wonder if I might inquire of the chairman whether or not the committee has received the courtesy of a response to the request that it made of the President of the United States, which request was voted by the committee at its meeting last Tuesday.
No, the committee has not received any response whatsoever concerning the committee's request that the committee meet with the President and receive a statement from the President and exercise the privilege of questioning the President about the matters involved in these tragedies known collectively as the Watergate affair.
Might it be possible, then, I really don't know it, in a civilized community, when the Congress can't even communicate with the President, I think that obviously serious problems exist. Is there anything further that counsel would suggest that can be done to get a response? I don't care whether, obviously I care, but what we don't have is either a yes or a no. All we have is a series of leaked statements, which I hardly consider a dignified response to what I believed was a courteous request by the committee of the President.
But I'm inclined to think the committee's done all they can do. We've been asking ever since Alexander Butterfield testified here and revealed the fact that that conversations with the President had been electronically recorded since from the spring of 1971 until after these hearings started. We've asked for those tapes, been refused them. We've asked for records and memoranda, and documents and other materials in the control, under control of the President, which are relevant to the matters this committee is authorized to investigate, and we have not received them. So I see nothing to do except to try to pursue our case. We have a bill passed through the Senate that gives the committee, gives the court's undoubted jurisdiction of the suit brought by the committee for the tapes and certain memoranda. And I'm informed by the House Judiciary Committee that unfortunately can't be acted on until after their recess. But I hope that we can pursue that case. I hope, above everything else, that the White House will relent and assist us in our search for the truth in respect to the Watergate affair. The committee will stand in recess till the 27th.
There we have it, another round of evidence on how Nixon campaign fundraisers put the arm on American business last year, and also how and why corporation executives did what they were told, even if it meant violating the law. Here now to discuss the matter with Peter Kay is Bob Jackson of the Los Angeles Times. Peter?
One of the reporters who's covered Watergate ever since it was a gleam in Gordon Liddy's eye almost is Bob Jackson, an investigative political reporter for the Los Angeles Times. Bob, after years of covering politics, I think you and I and other reporters for the first time are seeing really how funds are raised and what kind of subterfuges are used to conceal donations.
I think it's very revealing, Peter. I think much of this we all have the feeling has gone on for a number of years, but I think for the first time we're really documenting, getting chapter and verse on these activities, and I think it shows, today and yesterday, shows the tremendous working relationship, sort of the love affair that goes sour at times between big business and big government.
I think one of the interesting things that came out today, perhaps more than any time since these hearings have started, is one type of motive, and that is not so much the quid pro quo, the donation to get a favor, but the fear of the unknown, the terra incognita, as the last Mr. Spater put it.
Mm-hmm. I think the testimony we heard indicates that big corporations are first of all, looking for that edge over their competitors, and secondly, as you point out, there's this great fear that if they don't come across, if they don't follow the plaintiff requests and the implicit pressurous requests of some of the Republican fundraisers, people who have been close to the White House, that they're going to lose that competitive edge in dealing with the government. And, of course, this is a very competitive city, and all the big companies have their own lobbyists here. They have their own law firms, and in every little way they're looking for that edge.
And, of course, in the case of the airlines, here we have what Chairman Irvin very properly points out is one of the most heavily regulated businesses in the country, and one where the White House literally means life or death. Mm-hmm. The President himself awards routes, he awards merger decisions, mm-hmm. he awards fares, almost anything.
And at the very time that American Airlines was being pressured to contribute $100,000, American was jockeying for a position in a very competitive route case, a merger case with Western Airlines. And as Mr. Spater mentioned in his testimony, this was to no avail. They lost out, as it finally turned out. But all along, during the time that Mr. Spater was funneling money into CRP beginning in the fall of '71 until March of '72. I know from covering stories on this matter and from doing a little digging that American had their attorneys in contact with the White House during this very same period, trying to get information, trying to plead their case, and I'm sure the airline could not help but believe that at the same time they were funneling money into the treasury of the committee to re-elect the president, this was probably going a long way toward getting them better access.
So really, Mr. Spater wasn't just being naive when he said he couldn't get an answer out of the White House.
No, I think that he's very much an unnaive businessman, and I do think that he was being very candid, though, when he talked about the fears of the unknown. It's just a case of the White House can do so much to you simply by ignoring you, simply by refusing access to his company and people who work for it.
Bob, how do you think these executives come off? Are they sympathetic, or do you think people are going to be a little suspicious of them?
Well, I think people, Peter, have a right to be suspicious. I think that at the most, these executives who have come forward are reluctant heroes, if they're heroes at all. I think that really what we have seen is the amorality of American business. Businessmen who admittedly knew they were doing wrong, as they told this committee, when they contributed corporate funds in violation of the Corrupt Practices Act, but nevertheless did it. And I think that they just developed a relationship with the federal government, again, the big business, big government going hand in hand, that they felt that even if it's wrong, somehow it's acceptable, it's accepted practice. And I think that Senator Weicker put his finger on it very well toward the end of the hearings today when he said to Russell DeYoung of Goodyear that it's a very sorry day, isn't it? And I think that Mr. DeYoung really did not see what Senator Weicker meant when he first said it, but Weicker went on to point out that DeYoung had said that he had only come forward not out of a matter of principle, but because Goodyear feared the adverse publicity when they heard this was going to become public anyway.
And a $1,000 fine really isn't very much, as Chairman Irvin points out, for a billion-dollar corporation.
Exactly.
Bob,
Especially,
our time's up. Thanks very much. Appreciate your coming, and see you when they resume after Thanksgiving.
Thank you.
Jim?
Thank you, gentlemen. All right, the committee now takes some time off for Thanksgiving and other things, and then comes back in 12 days for a final spurt of public testimony. That's the current plan, at least, but as all regular Watergate watchers know, everything is subject to change. Presumably, the committee will take testimony then concerning the famous milk fund case and the equally famous Howard Hughes donation to Nixon friend Bebe Rebozo. But we shall see. For now, for our guest Bob Jackson, for Peter Kay and Impact, I'm Jim Lara. Thank you and good night.
Impact has brought you Washington, November 15th. Tonight, videotape coverage of today's hearings by the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities. This program was made possible by grants from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Ford Foundation. Washington, November 15th, has been a production of Impact, a division of the Greater Washington Educational Telecommunications Association.